This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. The night before Christmas was supposed to be filled with joy and anticipation. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. My family and I were driving along the coast, trying to find our way back to our vacation rental. We'd gone out for a last-minute shopping trip, but somehow we'd gotten turned around on the winding coastal roads. I was behind the wheel, my wife Julie in the passenger seat, and our two kids, Tommy and Sarah, in the back. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. I kept glancing at the lighthouse in the distance, using it as a beacon to guide us back. "Dad, are we lost?" Tommy asked, his voice tinged with worry. "No, buddy. We're just taking the scenic route," I replied, trying to sound confident. Julie shot me a look. She knew we were lost, but neither of us wanted to admit it in front of the kids. As darkness fell, the lighthouse became our only reference point. Its beams swept across the water, a comforting presence in the growing gloom. But then, without warning, it went dark. "What the hell?" I muttered, squinting into the darkness. "What's wrong?" Julie asked, leaning forward in her seat. "The lighthouse, it just went out." We all stared in disbelief at the now dark tower. Without its guiding light, the coastline became an indistinguishable mass of shadows. I slowed the car, peering at the road ahead. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, broken only by our headlights. The sound of waves crashing against the shore grew louder, reminding us how close we were to the water's edge. "Maybe we should turn back," Julie suggested, her voice tight with anxiety. I nodded, but as I tried to turn the car around, I realized we were on a narrow strip of sand. The tide was coming in fast, water already lapping at the tires. "Shit," I hissed, pressing down on the accelerator. We needed to find higher ground, and fast. Through the gloom, I spotted a dark shape looming ahead. As we got closer, I realized it was an old fishing shack, perched on a slight rise above the beach. "We'll stop there," I announced, more to reassure myself than anyone else. I pulled up next to the shack, the headlights illuminating its weathered boards and broken windows. The smell hit us as soon as I cut the engine, a pungent mix of rotting seaweed and something else I couldn't quite place. "Ugh, it stinks," Sarah complained, covering her nose. "It's just low tide," I lied, not wanting to worry them further. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic crash of waves and the whisper of wind through the gaps in the shack's walls. But then, carried on the breeze, I heard something else. Voices, low and eerie, singing what sounded like Christmas carols, but wrong somehow. The words were garbled, the melody discordant. "Do you hear that?" Julie whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. "It's probably just people on the beach, Christmas Eve parties and all that." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. There were no other cars, no lights, no signs of life anywhere around us. The singing grew louder, seeming to come from all directions at once. Tommy and Sarah huddled closer together in the back seat, their eyes darting from window to window. Suddenly, a loud creak cut through the night. We all jumped, our heads snapping towards the source of the sound. The door of the fishing shack was slowly swinging open. "Stay in the car," I ordered, my hand already on the door handle. "John, no!" Julie grabbed my arm. "We should just go." But I knew we couldn't. The tide was still coming in, and I had no idea which way led back to the main road. We needed to find shelter and wait for daylight. "I'll just take a quick look," I assured her. "Maybe there's a phone inside, or a map." Before she could protest further, I stepped out of the car. The wind immediately whipped around me, carrying that rotten smell and the distant, unsettling singing. I approached the shack cautiously, my footsteps crunching on the sand. The door creaked again as I pushed it wider, peering into the gloom inside. As my eyes adjusted, I saw shapes looming in the darkness. For a moment, I thought there were people inside, standing perfectly still. My heart leapt into my throat, but then I realized what I was seeing. Mannequins. A dozen or more of them, dressed in faded, moldy Santa Claus suits. Their blank faces seemed to stare at me, their painted-on smiles now more like grimaces in the dim light. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. As I did, I noticed something else. Colored lights were blinking in the broken windows of the shack. Red, green, blue, yellow, flickering on and off in a hypnotic pattern. But there was no power line running to the building, no generator that I could see. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I turned back to the car, ready to tell my family we needed to leave, now. But as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The car was gone. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But when I opened my eyes, the beach where we had parked was empty. No tire tracks, no sign that we had ever been there. Panic rising in my throat, I spun around, looking for any sign of my family or our vehicle. That's when I saw it. The lighthouse was back on, but instead of its usual white beam sweeping across the water, it glowed a steady, ominous red. I started running towards it, my feet slipping in the sand. But no matter how far I ran, the lighthouse never seemed to get any closer. The beach stretched out endlessly before me, the sound of waves and that eerie singing growing louder with each step. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning. Eventually, I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. As I looked up, I realized with a jolt that I was back where I started. The fishing shack loomed before me, its windows still blinking with those inexplicable lights. The door creaked open again, wider this time. In the doorway stood one of the Santa mannequins. But it wasn't a mannequin anymore. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, its painted-on eyes somehow fixing on me. I scrambled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The mannequin took a step forward, then another. Behind it, I could see the others starting to move as well. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I looked down and saw that the sand had turned to quicksand, slowly pulling me down. I thrashed and struggled, but it only made me sink faster. The singing grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the mannequins. Their mouths didn't move, but somehow they were producing those twisted Christmas carols. As they approached, their hands outstretched towards me, I sank deeper into the sand. The last thing I saw before the sand closed over my head was the red beam of the lighthouse, sweeping across the beach like the eye of some malevolent god. I jolted awake with a gasp, my heart pounding in my chest. I was in the car, Julie shaking my shoulder with a worried look on her face. John, wake up. You were having a nightmare." I looked around wildly. We were parked on the side of a road, trees on either side. No beach, no lighthouse, no creepy fishing shack. "What? Where are we?" I managed to croak out. "We got lost, remember? You pulled over to check the map, but you fell asleep," Julie explained. "The kids and I have been trying to wake you for the past 10 minutes. I looked in the back seat. Tommy and Sarah were there, looking at me with concern. I ran a shaking hand over my face, trying to shake off the lingering terror of the dream. "I'm sorry," I muttered. "I guess I was more tired than I thought." Julie handed me a folded paper. "I found this map in the glove compartment. I think I can get us back to the rental from here." I nodded, still too shaken to speak. As Julie started the car and pulled back onto the road, I unfolded the map with trembling hands. My blood ran cold. There, marked in red, was a lighthouse, and next to it, barely visible in the fold of the paper, was a tiny drawing of a fishing shack. I crumpled the map quickly, shoving it into my pocket. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, on a lonely stretch of beach, a red light was sweeping across the sand, and mannequins in Santa suits were waiting for unwary travelers. The rest of our Christmas vacation passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the lingering dread from that nightmare. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those mannequins, heard that twisted singing. I jumped at every creak, flinched at every blink of Christmas lights. We never did find that lighthouse or the fishing shack in reality, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear distant, discordant carols on the wind. And every Christmas Eve, I make sure we're safely at home, far away from any beaches or lighthouses, because deep down, I know it wasn't just a dream. Somewhere out there, that place exists, and I hope to God we never find it again. The mountains were supposed to be my escape. Instead, they became my prison. It was Christmas Eve, and I was miles from civilization, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't understand. But let me start from the beginning. I'm an experienced hiker. I've tackled some of the toughest trails in the country, but this time I bit off more than I could chew. I decided to do a solo trek through the Rockies, pushing myself to the limit before heading home for the holidays. I should have checked the weather more carefully. The storm hit without warning. One minute I was making good time along a ridge line, the next I was battling gale-force winds and snow so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I knew I was in trouble. I needed shelter, fast. My tent wouldn't stand up to this weather, and hypothermia was a real risk. That's when I saw it, a dark shape looming through the whiteout. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. I couldn't believe my luck. I staggered to the door, my fingers numb as I fumbled with the handle. It was unlocked. I practically fell inside, slamming the door behind me to shut out the howling wind. The cabin was dark and cold, but it was shelter. I fumbled for my flashlight, sweeping the beam around the room. It was sparse but functional, a fireplace, a couple of chairs, a small table, and a bed in the corner. No electricity, but there were candles on the mantel and a stack of firewood next to the hearth. I set about making a fire, my hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. As the flames caught and spread, I began to relax. I was safe. I'd wait out the storm here and head back down the mountain in the morning. That's when I noticed the writing. At first, I thought it was just random scratches on the floorboards. But as I looked closer, I realized they were words. Carved into the wood, barely visible in the flickering firelight, were two words repeated over and over: not alone. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I told myself it was nothing, probably just some kids messing around, or maybe the cabin's owner had gone a little stir-crazy during a long winter. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. I tried to distract myself by setting up my sleeping bag on the bed and organizing my gear. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind shrieking around the cabin's eaves. The silence inside felt oppressive in comparison, broken only by the crackling of the fire. That's when I heard it, a soft, tinkling melody. I froze, listening hard. It was coming from the far corner of the cabin. I swung my flashlight beam in that direction and saw a small, ornate music box sitting on a shelf I hadn't noticed before. I approached it cautiously. The tune it played was a Christmas carol, but slow and distorted, like a record played at the wrong speed. I hadn't touched it. How had it started playing on its own? I reached out to close the lid, but as my fingers touched the cold metal, the music stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening, and then, with a soft click, the cabin door locked itself. I spun around, my heart pounding. I ran to the door, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Panic rose in my throat. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, even though I knew no one could hear me over the storm. After a few minutes, I slumped against the wall, breathing hard. Think, I told myself. There has to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was an old lock, triggered by the vibrations of me walking around. Maybe the wind had somehow engaged it from the outside. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed the chair had moved. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. But no, the chair that had been by the fire was now halfway across the room, facing the bed. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been near it. My mouth went dry. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the cabin. Nothing else seemed to have changed, but suddenly every shadow looked menacing. I decided to try to sleep. Maybe I was more exhausted than I realized. Maybe I was imagining things. I climbed into my sleeping bag, leaving the fire burning low for light and warmth. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake, every nerve on edge. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim reddish glow over the cabin. I lay perfectly still listening. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cabin all was quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't even hear the ticking of my watch. Slowly, I turned my head towards the rest of the room. The chair had moved again. It was now at the foot of the bed, facing me directly, and on the wall behind it, barely visible in the dim light, was a portrait I was certain hadn't been there before. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the picture. It showed a man sitting in this very cabin, in that very chair, a man who looked exactly like me. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. I ran to the door again, pulling and pushing with all my might, but it remained stubbornly locked. The windows were no better, sealed shut and too small to climb through anyway. A sound behind me made me whirl around. The music box had started playing again, that same slow, distorted Christmas carol. But this time, underneath the melody, I could hear something else. Whispers, laughter, the sound of footsteps. I pressed my back against the door, my eyes wide as I scanned the room. Nothing moved, but the sounds continued. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The portrait on the wall caught my eye again. As I watched, unable to look away, the image began to change. The man, my doppelganger, slowly turned his head, his eyes locking with mine. A smile spread across his face, wide and unnatural. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that I didn't even recognize as my own voice. I threw myself at the door again, pounding and kicking, heedless of the pain in my hands and feet. Suddenly, the door gave way. I tumbled out into the snow, the icy wind like a slap in the face. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring which direction, just needing to get away from that cabin. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Finally, I collapsed in the snow, gasping for breath. As I lay there, the storm seemed to lessen, the wind dying down to a whisper. Slowly, I sat up, looking around. The sky was lightening, dawn was approaching, and there, in the distance, I could see the lights of the ranger station where I had started my hike. Relief flooded through me. I had made it. I was safe. As I stumbled towards the station, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation? A vivid nightmare? But when I reached into my pocket for my phone, my fingers closed around something else. I pulled it out, my hand shaking. It was the music box from the cabin. The Rangers found me a few hours later, huddled in the snow, clutching the music box and muttering about doppelgangers and locked doors. They said I was lucky to be alive. The storm had been one of the worst in recent memory. They never found the cabin. I led a search party back up the mountain as soon as I was well enough, but there was no sign of it, just endless snow and trees. But sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear that distorted Christmas carol playing faintly in the distance. And every time I look in a mirror, I can't shake the feeling that the face looking back at me isn't quite my own. I don't go hiking anymore, and I never, ever spend Christmas Eve alone. I never thought a Christmas village could be a place of nightmares, but here I am, trapped in a holiday hellscape that defies explanation. It all started when I decided to take a solo trip to Europe during the holidays. I wanted to experience the famous Christmas markets I'd heard so much about. Little did I know, I was walking into a nightmare. I arrived in the small town of Bergdorf on Christmas Eve. The travel brochure promised a quaint village with a traditional market, perfect for experiencing old-world holiday charm. As I stepped off the train, something felt off immediately. The platform was deserted. No other passengers, no station staff, not even a stray cat. Just me and my suitcase, standing alone in the falling snow. I chalked it up to the late hour and headed into town. The streets were lined with twinkling lights and garlands, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Shop windows displayed festive scenes, but inside, mannequins stood frozen in eerie tableaus. Their painted smiles seemed more like grimaces in the flickering light. I heard faint Christmas music in the distance and followed the sound, hoping to find some signs of life. As I walked, my footsteps echoed loudly on the cobblestones. The music never seemed to get closer, always just out of reach. Finally, I rounded a corner and saw the market square. Wooden stalls were set up in neat rows, decorated with pine boughs and ribbons. Strings of lights crisscrossed overhead. But like the rest of the town, it was completely empty. My heart was pounding now. Where was everyone? Had I somehow gotten the dates wrong? Was the market closed? I approached one of the stalls, peering at the wares inside. Hand-carved wooden ornaments hung in neat rows, their faces expertly crafted. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd. The smiles on the ornaments were too wide, stretching unnaturally across their wooden faces. A gust of wind blew through the square, causing the lights to sway. Shadows danced across the ground, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I needed to find someone, anyone, who could tell me what was going on. I spotted a building at the far end of the square with a sign that read, "Tourist Information," in several languages. Relief washed over me as I hurried towards it. The door creaked open as I pushed it, the sound impossibly loud in the silent square. Inside it was dark except for a single desk lamp. A woman sat behind the desk, her head bowed as if reading something. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Can you help me? I'm looking for—" The woman raised her head, and the words died in my throat. Her face was blank, expressionless, like a doll's. She smiled at me, but it was all wrong. Too wide, too still, not reaching her eyes. "Welcome to Bergdorf," she said. her voice oddly flat. "How may I assist you this holy night?" I backed away, my heart racing. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I turned and ran out of the office, back into the square. As I did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ornaments in the stalls had moved. They were all facing me now, their unnatural smiles seeming to mock my fear. I ran through the winding streets, trying to find my way back to the train station. But no matter which way I turned, I always ended up back in the market square. It was as if the town itself was changing around me, trapping me in its center. The Christmas music I'd heard earlier grew louder, but now I could make out the words. They weren't in any language I recognized, the melody distorted and wrong. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, pressing in on me from all sides. I stopped, pressing my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound. That's when I noticed the clock tower looming over the square. Its face read 11:59, the minute hand trembling on the edge of midnight. As I watched, time seemed to slow. The minute hand moved with agonizing slowness towards the 12. I held my breath, somehow knowing that when it struck midnight, something terrible would happen. The clock struck 12. The sound reverberated through the empty streets, impossibly loud. And then, everything changed. The lights in the square blazed to life, so bright I had to shield my eyes. When I lowered my hand, I saw that the square was no longer empty. People filled every inch of space, but they weren't people, not really. They were like the woman in the tourist office, blank-faced, doll-like, with those terrible fixed smiles. They all turned to look at me in unison, their eyes glassy and lifeless. I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of that twisted Christmas music. I ran. I don't know how long or how far. The streets blurred together, each turn bringing me face to face with more of those not quite people. They never moved to stop me, just watched with those empty eyes and frozen smiles. Finally, I found myself back at the train station. Hope surged through me as I raced towards the platform, but as I reached it, my heart sank. The tracks ended abruptly just beyond the platform, disappearing into a wall of impenetrable fog. I sank to my knees, exhaustion and despair washing over me. I was trapped. There was no way out. A hand fell on my shoulder, and I jerked away, scrambling to my feet. It was the woman from the tourist office. She stood there, still smiling that terrible smile. "The night is young," she said, her voice as flat and lifeless as before. "Won't you join our celebration?" Behind her, I could see the square had filled with more of those doll people. They were all facing me, waiting. In the center of the square stood an enormous Christmas tree, its branches heavy with those twisted ornaments. At the top, instead of a star, was a face, my face, smiling that same unnatural smile. I backed away, shaking my head. "No," I whispered. "No, this isn't real. It can't be real." The woman's smile widened impossibly. "But it is," she said, "and now you're a part of it, forever." I turned to run, but there was nowhere to go. The fog had closed in, leaving only the town square visible. As I watched in horror, the doll people began to move towards me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare, but when I opened them again, nothing had changed. The doll people were closer now, their hands outstretched towards me. The clock began to chime again, but this time it didn't stop at 12. It kept going, the sound growing louder and more distorted with each strike. The ornaments on the tree began to sing, their mouths moving in perfect sync with that terrible music. I felt hands grabbing me, pulling me towards the center of the square. I struggled, but there were too many of them. As they dragged me closer to the tree, I saw my reflection in one of the ornaments. My face was changing, becoming like theirs, blank, lifeless, with that horrible, fixed smile. I screamed one last time as they lifted me up, towards the top of the tree. The last thing I saw was my own face looking down at me, smiling that unnatural smile, before everything went dark. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't seem to work the same way in this place. The clock always reads 11:59, but midnight comes again and again. Each time new people arrive, confused and frightened. And each time we welcome them to our celebration. Sometimes in quiet moments, I remember who I used to be. I remember the fear, the desperation. But then the music starts again, and those thoughts fade away. After all, it's Christmas in Bergdorf, and the night is young. Won't you join our celebration? The night shift at Johnson's Holiday Emporium was supposed to be easy money. Watch the cameras, do some inventory, maybe catch up on sleep. Nobody told me I'd be fighting for my sanity in a warehouse full of Christmas decorations gone wrong. My name's Mike. I'm a college student picking up extra cash over winter break. When I saw the ad for a night watchman at a Christmas decoration warehouse, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Easy work, decent pay, and I could study during my shift. Perfect, right? Wrong. It started normally enough. I arrived at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve, ready for my first solo shift. The day guy, Dave, gave me a quick rundown. Not much to it, he said, leading me through rows of boxed decorations. Just keep an eye on the cameras, make sure nothing's out of place. Oh, and don't mind the noise. Place creaks a lot at night. I nodded, trying to look confident. No problem, I've got this. Dave hesitated at the door. One more thing. Don't go into Section C after midnight. We're reorganizing, and it's a mess. Wouldn't want you to trip and hurt yourself. I agreed, and he left. I settled into the small office, propping my feet up on the desk. The bank of security monitors showed empty aisles and quiet storerooms. Piece of cake. For the first hour, everything was fine. I did my rounds, checked the locks, and started on some homework. But around 1 a.m. things got weird. It started with the reindeer. I was watching the monitors when I saw movement in aisle 5. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. But no, a large plastic reindeer had definitely moved. It was now facing the camera instead of the wall. I rubbed my eyes. Must be tired, I thought. Probably just forgot which way it was facing before. But then it happened again, and again. Every time I looked away and back, more reindeer had moved. Always just slightly, always facing the cameras. My heart was pounding now. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there were motion sensors in the decorations, some kind of anti-theft device. I decided to check it out. Grabbing my flashlight, I headed to aisle 5. The reindeer were all where they should be, facing the wall. But as I turned to leave, I heard a soft scraping sound behind me. I whirled around. Nothing had moved, but the air felt different, heavier, and that smell, sickly sweet pine and plastic, stronger than before. Back in the office, I tried to shake it off. Just my imagination running wild, I told myself. But I couldn't stop watching the reindeer on the monitor. That's when I noticed the Santa mannequins in aisle 3. They were supposed to be in neat rows, but now they were scattered randomly across the aisle. As I watched, one turned its head slowly towards the camera. I fell out of my chair, scrambling backward. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. The radio on my belt crackled to life, making me jump. But instead of the usual static, I heard fragments of Christmas songs playing backwards. The cheerful melodies were distorted, sinister. I switched it off, my hands shaking. The warehouse had gone silent, too silent. Even the usual creaks and settling noises had stopped. Then, from somewhere deep in the building, I heard the unmistakable sound of sleigh bells. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but I couldn't leave my post. I needed this job. Taking a deep breath, I decided to do another round. I'd check every aisle, prove to myself nothing was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, trying to ignore how badly my hands were shaking. The main storage area was dark, lit only by dim emergency lights. My flashlight beam seemed feeble, swallowed by the shadows between the tall shelves. I started down aisle 1. Everything seemed normal. Boxes of ornaments, stacks of artificial trees. Nothing moving, nothing out of place. Aisle 2 was the same. I began to relax. See? Just my imagination. Then I reached aisle 3. The Santa mannequins were back in their rows, but they were all facing me now, their plastic faces frozen in wide, unnatural grins. And at the end of the aisle stood one that hadn't been there before. It was larger than the others, more lifelike. Its eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. As I reached the end of the aisle, I heard a loud click behind me. I spun around. The door to Section C had swung open. Darkness spilled out, darker than the rest of the warehouse, and from within I heard that sleigh bell sound again. Dave's warning echoed in my head. Don't go into Section C after midnight, but something was pulling me towards it. I had to know. I stepped through the door, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the gloom. The smell hit me immediately, rot and mildew under the artificial pine scent. Shapes loomed in the darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I realized they were more decorations, but these were wrong, broken, twisted. Reindeer with too many legs, Santas with gnashing teeth, angels with bat-like wings. My radio crackled again. This time, instead of music, I heard a voice, soft, childlike, but somehow wrong. "Do you want to play?" it asked. I dropped the radio, stumbling backward. My elbow hit a shelf, and something fell with a crash. The noise seemed to wake the room. Suddenly, everything was moving. Tinsel snaked across the floor like silvery tentacles. Lights blinked on and off, illuminating nightmarish scenes. I ran. I didn't care about the job anymore. I just needed to get out. But the warehouse had changed. Aisles shifted and moved, leading me in circles. Every turn brought me face to face with more horrors. Nutcrackers whose jaws worked soundlessly, elves with shark-like teeth and glowing eyes. I found myself back at the office. I lunged for the phone, but the line was dead. The monitors showed only static now, occasionally flickering to show glimpses of things I wouldn't comprehend. The sleigh bells were louder now, coming from everywhere at once. Mixed with them was a sound like laughter, but no human throat could make those noises. I huddled under the desk, squeezing my eyes shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A hand fell on my shoulder. I screamed, scrambling away. It was Dave. He stood in the doorway, looking at me with pity. "I told you not to go into Section C," he said softly. "What's happening?" I gasped. "What is this place?" Dave sighed. "It's not a place. Not really. It's a gathering. Every Christmas Eve they come. The lost decorations, the forgotten ornaments, the ones left in attics and basements year after year. They're angry, lonely, and they're hungry." As if on cue, a massive crash came from the warehouse. The walls shook, and I heard the sound of splintering wood and tearing metal. "They're here," Dave said, his eyes wide with fear. The office door slammed shut, locking us in. The monitors flickered to life, showing a scene of chaos. Decorations of all kinds were pouring into the main area, but they were changing, morphing into things that defied description. In the center of it all stood an enormous figure. It looked like Santa, if Santa had been created by a mind warped by terror and madness. It turned slowly, seeming to look directly into the camera, directly at me. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, and I heard that childlike voice again. "Time to play," it said. The lights went out. In the darkness, I heard Dave whimper, then a sound like tearing flesh, and he went silent. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. When the lights came back on, I was alone. The office was trashed, but there was no sign of Dave or the horrors I'd seen. I ran. Out of the office, through the warehouse, not stopping until I was in my car, peeling out of the parking lot. I drove until I ran out of gas, ending up in a small town I didn't recognize. As I sat there shaking, the sun began to rise. Christmas morning. I never went back to Johnson's Holiday Emporium. I tried to tell people what happened, but no one believed me. They said the warehouse had been empty for years. But every Christmas Eve, I lock my doors and windows. I throw away every decoration, every scrap of tinsel, and I lie awake listening for the sound of sleigh bells in the night, because I know they're out there, waiting, hungry, and someday they'll find me again. I've lived in this small mountain town for over 60 years, but I've never experienced anything like what happened last Christmas Eve. It was supposed to be a simple walk in the woods, a tradition I've kept since my husband passed. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. The day started normally enough. I woke up early, made my usual cup of tea, and watched the snow falling gently outside my kitchen window. The weather report said it would be clear by afternoon, perfect for my annual walk. Around 3 p.m., I bundled up in my warmest coat, pulled on my boots, and headed out. The path to the woods was familiar, just a short walk from my back door. The air was crisp and cold, my breath forming little clouds in front of me. As I entered the woods, I noticed how quiet it was. Usually there were birds chirping or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But today, there was nothing, just the soft crunch of snow under my feet. I didn't think much of it at first. It was Christmas Eve, after all. Maybe the animals were hunkered down, waiting for Santa, I joked to myself. The path I usually took was a loop, about an hour's walk, that would bring me back home in time for dinner. I'd done it so many times, I could probably walk it blindfolded. But as I reached the halfway point, something felt off. The trees seemed different, taller somehow. Their branches reached out farther, casting strange shadows on the snow. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Must be tricks of the light, I thought. That's when I noticed the animals. At first I was relieved to see signs of life. A squirrel perched on a low branch, a rabbit peeking out from behind a bush. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't moving, not even blinking. They just stared at me, their eyes unnaturally bright and fixed. My heart started to beat faster. This wasn't right. I turned to head back home, but the path behind me had disappeared. Where there should have been my footprints in the snow, there was only an unbroken white expanse. I tried to stay calm. I've lived here all my life, I told myself. I know these woods. I'll find my way back. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands. The snow began to fall again, heavy and fast, obscuring my vision. That's when I heard the bells, faint at first, like a distant church. But there are no churches in these woods. As the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to be all around me, filling the air with an eerie, echoing chime. I started to run, my breath coming in short gasps. The bells got louder, mixing with what sounded like voices chanting in a language I didn't recognize. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, falling face first into the snow. As I pushed myself up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, hanging from a branch right in front of me, was a wreath, but it wasn't made of pine boughs or holly. It was woven from some kind of strange, colorful straw, and it was moving, the strands twisting and writhing like snakes. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. That's when I noticed the footprints in the snow, small, like a child's, forming a perfect circle around me. I got to my feet, turning slowly. The woods had gone silent again. No bells, no chanting, just the soft fall of snow. But I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me, watching from every shadow, every hollow tree. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to keep my pace steady despite the panic rising in my throat. The snow was falling faster now, thick flakes that seemed to glow faintly in the growing darkness. After what felt like hours, I saw a light in the distance. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was a house or a road. Somewhere I could get help. I hurried towards it, pushing through the deep snow. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a house or a street light. It was a single candle, burning impossibly bright in the middle of a clearing. Next to the candle was my coat, the one I was wearing. I touched my arms, feeling the familiar fabric. But there it was, hanging from a branch as if I'd left it there. My mind reeled. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. The wind picked up, whispering words I couldn't quite make out. The candle flame danced wildly but didn't go out. And then, reflected in its light, I saw them. Footprints in the snow, appearing one by one in a circle around the clearing. Child-sized footprints, just like before. I turned to run, but the trees had closed in. There was nowhere to go. The footprints got closer and closer, but I couldn't see who or what was making them. Then, suddenly, they stopped, right in front of me. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed to run, fight, anything. A hand touched my arm, small, ice-cold. I looked down and saw nothing. Just the impression of fingers on my sleeve. The world tilted. The trees spun around me. I felt like I was falling, even though my feet were firmly on the ground. I closed my eyes, willing it all to go away. When I opened them again, I was standing at the edge of the woods, my woods. The familiar path leading to my back door stretched out in front of me. I ran, not looking back, not stopping until I was inside with the door locked behind me. I sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. It took me hours to calm down enough to think clearly. When I did, I convinced myself it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I'd gotten turned around in the woods and panicked. Maybe I'd fallen and hit my head. But then I saw it. There, hanging on my coat rack, was a wreath, made of strange, colorful straw. I haven't been back to the woods since that day. I tell people it's because of my age, that the walk is too much for me now. But the truth is, I'm afraid of what's out there, waiting in the shadows between the trees. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can hear bells in the distance. And when it snows, I check my yard for footprints, small ones that appear and disappear as if by magic. I don't know what happened to me in those woods. I don't know if it was real or some kind of waking nightmare. But I do know one thing. The woods are not empty, and they're watching, always watching. So if you find yourself in these mountains on a snowy Christmas Eve, stay out of the woods. Don't follow the lights. Don't listen to the bells. And if you see a wreath made of strange, colorful straw, run, and don't look back. Because in these woods, Christmas isn't a time of joy and celebration. It's something else, something old and hungry and patient. And it's waiting for you to take a wrong turn, to lose your way. because once you're lost in those woods, you might never find your way out again. The Sleepless Night Hotel wasn't my first choice for a Christmas Eve shift. But when you're new to the hospitality industry, you take what you can get. I never imagined that one night would turn my world upside down and leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. My name's Jack, and I've been working in hotels for about 6 months. The Sleepless Night is one of those old, grand places that's seen better days. Lots of faded charm and creaky floorboards. When I arrived for my shift at 11 p.m., the lobby was empty except for Carl, the day manager. "Quiet night ahead," he said, handing me the logbook. "We've only got one guest checked in, room 237. Bit of an odd duck, that one. Paid in cash, asked for a room with no windows. Wouldn't even give a name." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that allowed?" Carl shrugged. "Boss said it was fine. Just keep an eye out, yeah? And don't go bothering the guest unless it's an emergency." I nodded, settling in behind the desk as Carl left. The lobby was silent, the only sound the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock in the corner. I pulled out my book, prepared for a long, uneventful night. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps, clear as day, coming from the room right next to the lobby. Room 101. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. That room was supposed to be empty. I grabbed the master key and went to investigate. The door to 101 was closed, no sign of disturbance. I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath. Nothing. Just as I was about to unlock it, I heard a voice behind me. "Is there a problem?" I spun around, nearly jumping out of my skin. An old man stood there, watching me with pale, watery eyes. He was thin, almost gaunt, dressed in an outdated suit that hung loosely on his frame. I thought I heard something," I stammered. "In this room, but it's supposed to be empty." The old man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps it was me you heard. I was taking a stroll." "You're our guest?" I asked, confused. "But you're supposed to be in 237. "Am I?" he replied, his voice soft but somehow cold. "How interesting." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I hurried after him, but when I reached the intersection of hallways, he was gone. My hands were shaking as I returned to the desk. I checked the logbook again. Still only one guest listed, in room 237. I thought about calling Carl, but what would I say? That I was spooked by an old man taking a walk. I tried to focus on my book, but every creak and groan of the old building set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., the phone on the desk rang, making me jump. I answered it, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Front desk, how can I help you?" There was no response, just the sound of static and what might have been breathing. I was about to hang up when I heard it, a child's voice, distant and echoing, as if from the bottom of a well. "Is it time yet?" the voice asked. "Time for what?" I replied without thinking. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mouth dry. We didn't have any children checked in. Hell, we only had one guest, period. I checked the call log, but there was no record of an incoming call. That's when I noticed the postcard. It was sitting in my drawer, right on top of my wallet. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there earlier. It showed a Christmas scene, a snowy village with a church spire rising above the rooftops. But the colors were all wrong, too vivid, almost painful to look at. And the longer I stared at it, the more I felt like the tiny painted figures were moving. I flipped it over. On the back, in spidery handwriting, was my name and the hotel's address. No sender, no message, just my name. The phone rang again. I snatched it up, ready to demand answers. But this time, all I heard was the sound of bells. Not jingle bells, but deep, sonorous chimes that seemed to vibrate through my whole body. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I decided to do a round of the hotel just to reassure myself. The corridors were dark, lit only by the dim glow of emergency lights. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hallways were longer than they should be, the corners sharper, the shadows deeper. I found myself in front of room 237. For a long moment, I just stood there, listening. No sound came from inside. Against my better judgment, I knocked. No answer. I used the master key, telling myself I was just doing my job, checking on the guests' welfare. The door swung open silently. The room was empty, not just unoccupied, but completely bare. No furniture, no curtains, not even carpeting. Just bare walls and a wooden floor covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a single chair, facing the corner. I backed out, slamming the door. This was insane. I needed to call someone, get help. But when I turned around, the hallway had changed. The wallpaper, previously a faded floral pattern, now showed a repeating design of staring eyes. They seemed to follow me as I ran back towards the lobby. I burst into the reception area, ready to grab my phone and call the police, my boss, anyone. But I stopped short. The lobby had changed too. The furniture was different, older. Gas lamps flickered on the walls instead of electric lights. And behind the desk sat a woman in a Victorian-era dress, writing in a large ledger. She looked up as I entered, smiling pleasantly. "Good evening, sir. Checking in?" I couldn't speak. This wasn't possible. I backed away, turning to flee. But instead of the hotel entrance, I found myself facing a long corridor I'd never seen before. At the far end stood the old man from earlier, beckoning to me. Against my will, I felt my feet carrying me towards him. As I got closer, I realized he wasn't as old as I'd first thought. In fact, his face seemed to be growing younger with each step I took. By the time I reached him, he looked exactly like me. "Right on time," my doppelganger said, his voice identical to mine. "Your shift is over. My turn now." He placed a hand on my shoulder, and the world spun. I felt like I was falling, tumbling through space and time. I woke up in my own bed, sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a bizarre dream, but then I saw it, the postcard on my nightstand, my name written on the back in that spidery handwriting. I never went back to the Sleepless Night Hotel. I quit my job that day, left town, tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I hear bells in the distance. And when I look in the mirror, just for a second, I see a face that's not quite mine looking back. I don't know what happened that Christmas Eve. I don't know if it was real or some kind of hallucination. But I do know this. Be careful where you work on Christmas Eve, because some shifts never end, and some hotels have rooms you can check into, but never leave. I never thought delivering food on Christmas Eve would lead me into a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened last year, and I'm still trying to make sense of it. My name's Alex, and I work for one of those app-based food delivery services. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. When I saw the opportunity for extra holiday pay, I jumped at it. Big mistake. The night started normally enough. I picked up orders, dropped them off, rinse and repeat. The streets were quiet. Most people already settled in for their Christmas Eve celebrations. Around 11 p.m., I got an order that would change everything. The app pinged, showing a delivery to an address in the old part of town. You know the type. Victorian houses, narrow streets, lots of history. The kind of place tourists love during the day, but gives you the creeps at night. I punched the address into my GPS and set off. As I rode my bike through the empty streets, I noticed something odd. All the Christmas decorations seemed old, not vintage or retro, but actually aged. Faded garlands hung limply from lampposts. Santa figures in shop windows were dusty and cracked. I shrugged it off. Maybe this neighborhood was big on antiques. The GPS beeped, telling me I was close. I turned onto a street called Willow Lane and immediately felt something was wrong. The streetlights were out, leaving the road in near total darkness. The houses loomed on either side, their windows dark and lifeless. No Christmas lights, no decorations, just rows of shadowy, silent buildings. I checked my phone. The signal was gone. Great. I pedaled slowly down the street, squinting at house numbers. That's when I noticed the silence. Not just quiet, but a complete absence of sound. No distant traffic, no wind in the trees. Nothing. My heart was pounding now, each beat unnaturally loud in the stillness. I wanted to turn back, but I needed this job. I kept going. Finally, I saw it. Number 13, Willow Lane. A Victorian mansion, paint peeling. Windows dark except for a single candle flickering in an upstairs room. I propped my bike against a gnarled old tree and approached the house. The porch steps creaked under my feet, the sound jarringly loud. I reached for the doorbell but hesitated. Something about this place felt wrong. Before I could decide what to do, I heard it. A voice carried on a wind I couldn't feel. "Alex," it whispered, somehow both distant and right next to my ear. I spun around, nearly falling off the porch. The street was empty, but as I watched, the shadows seemed to move, to deepen. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the food bag. I'd leave it on the porch, contact support later to explain. I just needed to get out of here. As I turned to go, the door creaked open behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned back. The doorway was empty, but beyond it, I could see a long, dark hallway. At the far end, barely visible, was a figure. It looked like a child, but something about its proportions was off. "Hello?" I called, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "I've got your delivery." The figure didn't move or speak. It just stood there, watching. I should have left then, should have dropped the food and run, but something compelled me to step inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Hey!" I shouted, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" A giggle echoed down the hallway. I turned back, my heart racing. The child figure was gone. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long. Family portraits lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. I tried to focus on my breathing, on staying calm. This had to be some kind of prank, right? I reached the end of the hall and found myself in a large living room. Dusty furniture was arranged around a fireplace where a small fire flickered. On the mantel was a row of Christmas stockings, each bearing a name. I stepped closer, squinting to read them in the dim light. My blood ran cold as I made out the names. They were all people I knew. My parents, my sister, my best friend. And at the end, one that simply said, "Alex." A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, raising the food bag like a shield. An old woman stood there, smiling at me. She looked like she'd stepped out of another century, dressed in a high-collared black dress, her white hair pulled into a severe bun. "We've been waiting for you, Alex," she said, her voice creaky but somehow familiar. "Who are you?" I demanded. "How do you know my name?" Her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Why, we know everything about you, dear. We've been watching you for so long." As she spoke, more figures emerged from the shadows. Men, women, children, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes. all smiling those two wide smiles. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "What do you want?" The old woman laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "We want you to join us, of course. We need new blood for our family." The others began to move towards me, their movements jerky and unnatural. I looked for an escape, but they were blocking every exit. That's when I noticed the window. Without thinking, I ran for it, hurling myself through the glass. I felt it shatter around me, heard the shocked cries of the family behind me. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me, but fear gave me strength. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The street had changed. The houses were gone, replaced by gnarled, leafless trees. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy, unreal. I ran anyway, not daring to look back. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs burned, my legs ached. But every time I slowed, I heard that whispered, "Alex," on the non-existent wind, spurring me on. Finally, I burst out onto a familiar street. Cars honked, people shouted. Normal city sounds I never thought I'd be so glad to hear. I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. A couple of passers-by stopped to ask if I was okay. I must have looked a mess, covered in cuts from the window, wild-eyed and panting. I managed to get home somehow. I quit my job the next day, couldn't face the possibility of another delivery to Willow Lane. For weeks after, I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every whisper of wind. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to find Willow Lane again, in daylight, but it wasn't there. No one I asked had ever heard of it. The GPS showed no record of the street existing. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that whispered "Alex" on the wind. And when I check my phone for just a split second, I see an order waiting for delivery to 13 Willow Lane. I don't do deliveries anymore. I don't go out on Christmas Eve. And I never, ever open the door to strangers, because I know they're out there, waiting, and next time I might not be able to run away. The shortcut was supposed to save us time. Instead, it trapped us in a nightmare that still haunts me every Christmas Eve. I'm Tom, and this is the story of how a simple drive to visit family turned into the most terrifying night of our lives. It was December 24th, and my sister Sarah and I were driving to our parents' house for Christmas. We were running late, as usual. Sarah was fiddling with the GPS, trying to find a faster route. "Hey, I think I found a shortcut," she said, pointing to a small road on the map. "It'll save us at least an hour." I glanced at it skeptically. "I don't know. It looks pretty remote." "Come on, Tom. Do you want to miss Mom's Christmas Eve dinner?" I sighed and took the turn she indicated. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forest. As we drove deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around us, their bare branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out the moonlight. "This doesn't look right," I muttered, peering through the windshield. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness ahead. Sarah checked her phone. The GPS signal's gone. Great. I was about to suggest turning back when something caught my eye. A Christmas tree right there on the side of the road. It was fully decorated, lights twinkling in the darkness. "Did you see that?" I asked Sarah. She nodded, frowning. "Who would put a Christmas tree out here?" As we passed it, the lights on the tree went out. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Maybe we should turn around," Sarah said, her voice uncertain. I nodded, looking for a place to turn, but the road had narrowed even further, with steep ditches on either side. There was nowhere to turn around. "We'll find a spot soon," I assured her, though I was starting to feel uneasy myself. The car radio, which had been playing Christmas songs, suddenly switched to static. Sarah reached to turn it off, but before she could, a voice came through the speakers. It was singing in Latin, the words unfamiliar and oddly discordant. "What the hell?" I muttered, hitting the power button. The radio stayed on, the eerie singing continuing. Sarah's face was pale in the dim light of the dashboard. "Tom, I don't like this." I didn't either, but I tried to stay calm. "It's probably just some weird interference. We'll be out of range soon." But we weren't. The singing continued, growing louder, and then, without warning, the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," I groaned, coasting to a stop. I tried to restart the car, but nothing happened, not even a click. We sat in silence for a moment, the Latin singing from the radio the only sound. Then Sarah pointed ahead. "Look!" There, in the distance, was a light. It looked like it might be coming from a building. "Maybe they have a phone we can use," I said, trying to sound optimistic. We grabbed our flashlights and got out of the car. The cold hit me immediately, far more intense than it should have been. My breath formed thick clouds in front of my face. As we walked towards the light, I noticed something odd. The snow around us was pristine, unbroken by any tracks. But behind us, where we had just walked, there were no footprints. I nudged Sarah. "Look at the snow." She glanced back, her eyes widening. "How is that possible?" Before I could answer, we heard it. Children's voices, laughing and singing, coming from the building ahead. But the words were all wrong, distorted and backwards. We approached cautiously. It was an old barn, the wood weathered and gray. The door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling out. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there? We need help." The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. I pushed the door open wider, peering inside. The barn was empty except for a pile of hay and a small bell hanging from a beam. As we watched, the bell began to swing on its own, ringing softly. Sarah grabbed my arm. "We need to go, now." I nodded, thoroughly creeped out. We turned to leave but stopped short. The path back to our car had vanished. In its place was an endless expanse of snow-covered field, broken only by the dark line of trees in the distance. "This isn't possible," I muttered, my heart racing. "Where's the road?" Sarah was shaking now, her grip on my arm painfully tight. "Tom, what's happening?" I wished I had an answer for her. We stood there, paralyzed with fear and confusion, as the bell in the barn continued its soft, steady ringing. That's when we saw it. A Christmas tree, identical to the one we'd seen earlier, standing alone in the middle of the field. Its lights blinked on and off, seeming to beckon us. "Do we go to it?" Sarah whispered. I shook my head. "I don't think we should." But even as I said it, I felt a pull towards the tree. My feet started moving of their own accord. Sarah's too, judging by her startled gasp. As we got closer, I realized the lights weren't electric. They were candles, hundreds of them, their flames an unnatural blue. The pull grew stronger the closer we got. I tried to stop, to turn back, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like wading through molasses, every step a huge effort. We were just a few feet from the tree when the singing started again. This time, it wasn't coming from a radio or distant voices. It was all around us, filling the air with its backwards melody. The candles on the tree flared brightly, then went out all at once. In the sudden darkness, I felt something brush against my hand, cold, small fingers intertwining with mine. I jerked away, finally able to move freely again. I grabbed Sarah and we ran, not caring which direction, just needing to get away. We ran until our lungs burned, the sound of that awful singing fading behind us. Finally we stopped, gasping for breath. "Where are we?" Sarah panted. I looked around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. We were back on a road, but it wasn't the same one we'd been on before. This one was wider, paved. In the distance I could see lights, normal electric lights from houses and street lamps. I think we're back, I said, hardly daring to believe it. We started walking towards the lights. As we got closer, I recognized the outskirts of our parents' town. Somehow, impossibly, we had ended up exactly where we were supposed to be. Our parents were frantic when we arrived, hours late and looking like we'd been through hell. We tried to explain what happened, but it sounded insane even to our own ears. The police searched for the road we described, but found nothing. Our car was discovered parked on the side of the main highway, exactly where it should have been if we'd taken the normal route. Sarah and I don't talk about that night much. It's easier to pretend it was some shared hallucination, a weird dream brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But every Christmas Eve, I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of backwards singing ringing in my ears, and sometimes, when I look out the window, I swear I can see a lone Christmas tree in the distance, its candles burning with that unnatural blue flame. We don't take shortcuts anymore, and we never ever drive on Christmas Eve. I never thought a simple night shift at a convenience store could turn into a living nightmare. But that's exactly what happened to me last Christmas Eve, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. My name's Mike, and I've been working at the Quick Stop for about 6 months. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. When my boss asked if I'd cover the overnight shift on Christmas Eve, I didn't think twice. Time and a half pay, plus it's usually dead quiet. Easy money, right? Wrong. I arrived at 11 p.m., relieving the evening guy, Dave. He gave me the usual rundown. Stock the coolers, keep an eye out for shoplifters, that sort of thing. Nothing out of the ordinary. Shouldn't be too busy, Dave said as he headed out. Merry Christmas, Mike. I settled in behind the counter, pulled out my book, and prepared for a long, uneventful night. For the first couple of hours, everything was normal. A few last-minute shoppers picking up forgotten items for Christmas dinner. A couple of drunk guys buying more beer. The usual late-night crowd. But around 1 a.m., things started to get weird. I was restocking the chip aisle when I heard the automatic doors slide open. I called out a greeting, but there was no response. I poked my head around the aisle, expecting to see a customer browsing, but the store was empty. I frowned, walking to the front. The doors were closed. I must have imagined it, I thought. Back at the counter, I noticed the clock on the cash register. 11:45 p.m. That couldn't be right. I checked my phone. 1:13 a.m. I tried to change the register's time, but it was frozen. No matter what I did, it stayed at 11:45. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just a glitch, nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That's when I heard it. Footsteps on the roof. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking back and forth. My heart started racing. We'd had problems with kids climbing on the roof before, but not at this hour. And these footsteps sounded heavy, too heavy for a kid. I grabbed the phone to call the police, but as I picked up the receiver, I realized there was no dial tone, just static, and beneath it, what sounded like someone breathing. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. The automatic doors slid open again. I spun around, expecting to see someone enter, but there was no one there. The doors stayed open for a long moment, letting in a gust of cold air, then slowly closed. I ran to the doors, checking the sensor, looking for any malfunction. Everything seemed normal, but as I turned back to the store, I saw something that made my blood run cold. All the packages of cookies had fallen off their shelves, but they hadn't just fallen randomly. They were arranged on the floor in a perfect geometric pattern, like some kind of bizarre crop circle. I backed away, my mind reeling. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. I ran to the office thinking I'd check the security cameras. Maybe they could make sense of what was happening. But when I looked at the monitors, all I saw was static, except for one. The camera pointing at the front of the store showed the parking lot, empty except for my car, and standing next to it was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as it stared directly into the camera. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I ran back to the main store, not sure what I was going to do, just knowing I needed to get out. That's when I saw the writing on the windows. Frost had formed on the inside of the glass, spelling out words in a language I didn't recognize. The letters seemed to squirm and shift as I watched, rearranging themselves into new patterns. The phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly fell over. For a moment, I just stared at it. It had been dead just minutes ago. It rang again, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet store. With a shaking hand, I picked up the receiver. Hello? A soft, childlike voice answered. Are you ready for the holy night? I dropped the phone like it had burned me. The voice continued, now coming from the dangling receiver. It's almost time. Are you ready? I backed away, looking wildly around the store. The lights were flickering now, casting strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The geometric pattern of cookies had changed, the packages now forming a spiral that led towards the center of the store. In the coolers, the drinks had rearranged themselves. Each bottle now faced outward, and I realized with growing horror that the labels had changed. Every single one now bore my face, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. The music system crackled to life, playing distorted Christmas carols. The melodies were wrong, discordant, the lyrics replaced with that same unknown language from the frosted windows. I ran to the front doors, yanking on them desperately. They wouldn't budge. I was locked in. Turning back to the store, I saw the convex security mirrors on the ceiling had changed. Instead of reflecting the store, they showed impossible scenes. In one, I saw myself standing in a snowy field, surrounded by twisted, leafless trees. In another, I was in a dark room, a single candle illuminating a book with blank pages. The childlike voice spoke again, now seeming to come from everywhere at once. The time has come. Join us in celebration. The lights went out, plunging the store into darkness. In the silence that followed, I heard the soft chime of bells. Then, from the back of the store, I saw a glow. Soft at first, but growing brighter. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself walking towards it. As I rounded the corner into the stockroom, I saw the source of the light. A Christmas tree stood there, where I knew there hadn't been one before. But this was no ordinary tree. Its branches were made of twisted metal, its needles razor-sharp. Ornaments hung from it, each one a tiny, perfect replica of the store. And at the top, instead of a star, was a face. My face, mouth open in a silent scream. The tree began to rotate slowly, the light pulsing in time with the distorted carols. As it turned, I saw shapes moving behind it. dark figures, their edges blurred and shifting, reaching out towards me with two long arms. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that I didn't even recognize as my own voice. I turned and ran, not caring where, just needing to get away. I don't remember how I got out of the store. The next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. When I finally stopped, I was miles away. The sun was coming up, Christmas morning dawning bright and clear. I looked at my phone, 6:00 a.m. Somehow, hours had passed. I never went back to the quick stop. I quit that day, left town, tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the chime of bells. And when I look in the mirror just for a second, I see that tree-topper staring back at me, mouth open in that silent, eternal scream. I don't know what happened that Christmas Eve. I don't know if it was real or some kind of hallucination. But I do know this. I'll never work another night shift. And I'll never, ever look at a Christmas tree the same way again. I never thought a Christmas market could be a gateway to terror. But that's exactly what happened to me last year, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. My name's Jack, and I'm an American tourist who decided to spend the holidays exploring Europe. I'd heard so much about the famous Christmas markets, especially in Germany. The one in the small town of Bergdorf was supposed to be a hidden gem, off the beaten path. I should have known better. I arrived in Bergdorf on Christmas Eve, excited to experience some old-world holiday charm. The town seemed quaint enough at first glance, with its narrow cobblestone streets and half-timbered houses. But as I made my way to the market square, I noticed something odd. The streets were empty, not just quiet, but completely deserted. I chalked it up to everyone being at the market and kept walking. The sound of faint music in the distance spurred me on, but no matter how far I walked, the music never seemed to get any closer. Finally, I rounded a corner and saw the market square. Wooden stalls were set up in neat rows, decorated with pine boughs and twinkling lights. But like the rest of the town, it was eerily empty. My heart started to race. Where was everyone? Had I gotten the dates wrong somehow? I approached one of the stalls, peering at the wares inside. Hand-carved wooden ornaments hung in neat rows, their faces expertly crafted. But as I looked closer, I noticed something unsettling. The smiles on the ornaments were too wide, stretching unnaturally across their wooden faces. A gust of wind blew through the square, causing the lights to sway. I shivered, suddenly aware of how cold it had become. That's when I heard it. Voices, speaking in a dialect I couldn't understand. The words sounded garbled, almost like they were being played backward. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me. But the square was still empty. The voices seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My palms were sweating despite the cold. I needed to find someone, anyone, who could tell me what was going on. I spotted a building at the far end of the square with a sign that read, "Tourist Information," in several languages. Relief washed over me as I hurried towards it. The door creaked open as I pushed it, the sound impossibly loud in the silent square. Inside it was dark except for a single desk lamp. A woman sat behind the desk, her head bowed as if reading something. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Can you help me? I'm looking for—" The woman raised her head, and the words died in my throat. Her face was blank, expressionless, like a doll's. She smiled at me, but it was all wrong, too wide, too still, not reaching her eyes. "Welcome to Bergdorf," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "How may I assist you this holy night?" I backed away, my heart pounding. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I turned and ran out of the office, back into the square. As I did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ornaments in the stalls had moved. They were all facing me now, their unnatural smiles seeming to mock my fear. I ran through the winding streets, trying to find my way back to the train station. But no matter which way I turned, I always ended up back in the market square. It was as if the town itself was changing around me, trapping me in its center. The voices grew louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words now, but they were in a language I'd never heard before. The sound pressed in on me from all sides, making it hard to think. I stopped, pressing my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise. That's when I noticed the clock tower looming over the square. Its face read 11:59, the minute hand trembling on the edge of midnight. As I watched, time seemed to slow. The minute hand moved with agonizing slowness towards the 12. I held my breath, somehow knowing that when it struck midnight, something terrible would happen. The clock struck 12. The sound reverberated through the empty streets, impossibly loud. And then everything changed. The lights in the square blazed to life, so bright I had to shield my eyes. When I lowered my hand, I saw that the square was no longer empty. People filled every inch of space, but they weren't people, not really. They were like the woman in the tourist office, blank-faced, doll-like, with those terrible fixed smiles. They all turned to look at me in unison, their eyes glassy and lifeless. I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony of that twisted language. I ran. I don't know how long or how far. The streets blurred together, each turn bringing me face to face with more of those not quite people. They never moved to stop me, just watched with those empty eyes and frozen smiles. As I ran, I noticed other things. The snow on the ground was stained with dark patches, forming symbols I didn't recognize. The Christmas lights on the buildings seemed to spell out words in that same unknown language, disappearing when I tried to focus on them. I found myself in front of a small shop. The window display caught my eye. It was full of Advent calendars. But these weren't normal calendars. The dates were all wrong, jumbled and out of order. Some had numbers I'd never seen before. My watch had stopped working. When I checked my phone, I saw the time counting backward. 11:58, 11:57, 11:56. The voices were all around me now, a constant maddening chatter. I could feel them pressing against my skin, trying to get inside my head. I turned a corner and found myself back in the market square, but it had changed again. The stalls were gone. In their place was a massive Christmas tree, taller than any I'd ever seen. Its branches were heavy with those creepy ornaments, all of them now bearing my face, twisted in expressions of terror. At the base of the tree stood a figure. It looked like Santa Claus, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, its red suit hanging loosely on its frame. Its beard was matted and filthy, its eyes milky white. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, it slowly raised a bony finger and pointed directly at me. The crowd of doll people parted, forming a path between me and the twisted Santa. I felt an irresistible pull, drawing me forward. I tried to fight it, but my legs moved of their own accord. With each step, the world around me seemed to warp and twist. The buildings bent at impossible angles. The sky, visible between the warped structures, swirled with colors that shouldn't exist. I reached the base of the tree. The Santa figure loomed over me, its blank eyes boring into mine. It opened its mouth, and I heard that childlike voice again, the same one that had been haunting me all night. "You're just in time," it said. "The ceremony is about to begin." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The Santa reached out with one long, bony hand. As its fingers touched my forehead, the world exploded into blinding light. I found myself standing on the outskirts of town, the sun rising on Christmas morning. The streets were normal, filled with early risers heading to church or preparing for family gatherings. There was no sign of the nightmare I'd just experienced. I stumbled to the train station, my mind reeling. Had it all been a dream? Some kind of hallucination? But as I waited for the first train out of Bergdorf, I noticed something in my pocket. It was a small wooden ornament, intricately carved. It showed a scene of the town square, complete with the massive tree and the crowd of blank-faced figures. And there, at the base of the tree, was a tiny figure, me, frozen in eternal terror. I threw the ornament away and got on the first train that arrived, not caring where it was going. I just needed to get as far away from Bergdorf as possible. I've tried to forget what happened that night. I've told myself it wasn't real, that it was just stress or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But sometimes, late at night, I hear those voices again, speaking in that unknown language. And when I look in the mirror, just for a second, I see a face that's not quite mine looking back at me, its smile too wide, its eyes too blank. I don't know what really happened in Bergdorf. I don't know if I'll ever understand it, but I do know this. I'll never visit another Christmas market again, and I'll always wonder if somewhere in that twisted version of Bergdorf, a part of me is still there, trapped in an endless, terrifying Christmas Eve. The night was cold, and the road stretched endlessly before me. I was driving alone on Christmas Eve, my headlights cutting through the thick blanket of snow that covered the rural landscape. The radio crackled, spitting out distorted Christmas carols that barely pierced the silence of the car's interior. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as the fog rolled in, reducing visibility to mere feet in front of my vehicle. That's when I first saw her, a figure at the side of the road, arm outstretched, thumb extended in the universal sign for a hitchhiker. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of her clothes. They looked old-fashioned, like something from a different era. I kept driving, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. My heart rate picked up as I saw her again, closer this time. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't picked her up. So how was she getting nearer? The dashboard lights began to flicker, but the engine continued to run smoothly. Despite this, an uncomfortable chill seeped into the car. I reached for the heater controls, turning them up to full blast, but the cold persisted. As I drove on, I became acutely aware of a presence in the back seat. I couldn't see anything when I looked, but I felt the weight of something there, pressing down on the upholstery. My palms began to sweat despite the cold, and I gripped the steering wheel even tighter. The radio continued its eerie performance. One moment, it was playing Silent Night. The next, it was filled with incomprehensible whispers that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. I focused on the road ahead, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That's when I noticed the change. The once straight road now curved and twisted, and fresh footprints appeared on the frozen asphalt, tracking alongside my car. My breathing quickened as I realized they weren't my tire tracks. They were human footprints, keeping pace with my vehicle. In the distance, the trees seemed to bow inward, their branches reaching over the road like gnarled fingers. They appeared to be watching me, silent witnesses to this nightmarish drive. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the image remained. Time began to feel distorted. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but it didn't make sense. Sometimes it seemed frozen, the digits unmoving despite the passing scenery. Other times it raced forward, minutes ticking by in seconds. I couldn't trust my own perception anymore. As I rounded another bend, the landscape disappeared into a profound darkness. The headlights seemed to be swallowed by the black void ahead. I had a sinking feeling in my gut, a certainty that I had never truly been alone on this drive. I considered stopping the car, but fear kept my foot on the gas pedal. What if she caught up? What if whatever was in the back seat decided to make itself known? So I pressed on, deeper into the impenetrable darkness. The radio's whispers grew louder, almost forming words now. I strained to understand them, against my better judgment. Were they trying to warn me, or lure me further into this nightmare? Suddenly my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the car fishtailing on the icy surface. As it skidded to a stop, I found myself face to face with the hitchhiker. Up close, her appearance was even more unsettling. Her clothes were tattered and covered in frost, as if she'd been out in the cold for days, not hours. Her skin was pale, almost blue, and her eyes were completely black, reflecting no light. She smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. I sat frozen, unable to move as she approached the driver's side window. Her fingernails, long and jagged, tapped against the glass. The sound echoed in the car, drowning out even the whispers from the radio. "Let me in," she mouthed, her breath fogging the window. "It's cold out here." I shook my head, my voice caught in my throat. She frowned, and the temperature in the car plummeted. Frost began to form on the inside of the windshield. "Let me in," she repeated, her voice now coming through the radio. "Don't you know it's Christmas? Where's your holiday spirit?" I fumbled for the gear shift, my fingers numb with cold and fear. The engine sputtered as I tried to reverse. The hitchhiker's smile widened, impossibly wide. "You can't leave," she said, her voice now coming from the back seat. "The road goes on forever, but it always leads back to me." I turned to look, and there she was, sitting calmly in the rear of the car. I screamed, throwing myself against the driver's side door. It wouldn't open. "Don't be afraid," she said, reaching out a pale hand. "I just want to share your warmth. It's been so long since I felt warm." Her fingers brushed my shoulder, and I felt a deep, penetrating cold seep into my bones. The world outside the car faded away, replaced by swirling snow and darkness. "Where are we going?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Home," she replied, her black eyes gleaming. "We're going home." The car lurched forward, driving itself now. I was powerless to stop it, powerless to do anything but watch as the darkness swallowed us whole. The last thing I remember is the sound of bells, distant and mournful, as we disappeared into the endless night. I don't know how long we drove. Time lost all meaning in that endless darkness. The hitchhiker hummed softly, her cold hand still on my shoulder. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my mind unable to cope with the reality of what was happening. When I opened my eyes again, we were parked in front of an old, dilapidated house. The paint was peeling, the windows dark and empty. Snow covered the overgrown lawn, untouched by footprints or tire tracks. "We're here," the hitchhiker said, her voice filled with an unsettling excitement. "Come, let me show you your new home." I didn't want to move, but my body obeyed her command. My legs carried me out of the car and towards the house, even as my mind screamed in protest. The front door creaked open as we approached, revealing a dark, musty interior. The inside of the house was frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture, yellowed photographs on the walls, a Christmas tree in the corner with ornaments that looked decades old. The hitchhiker moved through the rooms with familiarity, her hand trailing over surfaces, leaving frost in its wake. "I've waited so long for someone to come home," she said, turning to face me. "Do you like it? I've kept it just as it was. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this nightmare. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was trapped, not just in this house, but in whatever twisted reality the hitchhiker had pulled me into." She led me to a bedroom upstairs, a child's room with faded posters on the walls and toys scattered across the floor. In the center was a small bed, the covers turned down invitingly. "Rest now," she said, gently pushing me towards the bed. "Tomorrow is Christmas. We have so much to celebrate." I lay down, my body heavy with exhaustion and fear. As my eyes closed, I heard the hitchhiker's voice, soft and almost tender. "Merry Christmas," she whispered. "Welcome home." The next morning, if it was morning, time seemed meaningless here. I awoke to the sound of Christmas carols. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But as I opened my eyes, I saw the faded wallpaper of the child's room, felt the musty sheets beneath me. The hitchhiker appeared in the doorway, her black eyes gleaming with excitement. "Come downstairs," she said. "I've prepared breakfast." In the kitchen, a feast was laid out on the table. Turkey, stuffing, pies, all the trappings of a Christmas dinner. But everything was covered in a layer of frost, icicles hanging from the edges of the plates. "Eat," she urged, pushing me towards a chair. "It's been so long since I've had company for the holidays." I sat, staring at the frozen food before me. My stomach churned with hunger and revulsion. The hitchhiker watched me expectantly, her smile never wavering. "I can't eat this," I said, my voice hoarse. "It's frozen solid." Her smile faltered for a moment, a look of confusion crossing her face. "Is it?" she asked, looking at the food as if seeing it for the first time. I don't remember how it's supposed to be." For a moment I felt a pang of pity for her, but it was quickly replaced by fear as her expression hardened. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice cold. "You're here now. That's all that matters." Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. The house remained in a perpetual state of Christmas Eve, the tree in the corner never wilting, the presents underneath never opened. The hitchhiker was always there, watching me with her black eyes, talking about Christmases past as if they had happened yesterday. I tried to escape once, running out into the snow-covered yard. But no matter how far I ran, I always ended up back at the house, the hitchhiker waiting for me on the porch with a disappointed look on her face. "Why do you keep trying to leave?" she asked. "Don't you understand? This is your home now. We're family." As time wore on, I felt myself changing. The cold that had seeped into my bones that first night spread, numbing me from the inside out. My reflection in the mirrors grew paler, my eyes darker. I found myself humming along to the endless Christmas carols, my voice harmonizing with the hitchhikers. One day, or night, it was impossible to tell, I found myself standing by the road, arm outstretched. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the fog. As it passed, I caught a glimpse of the driver's face, eyes wide with fear. I smiled, my teeth sharp in the darkness. The hitchhiker stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "See," she said, "now you understand. We'll never be alone again." As the car disappeared into the night, I felt a sense of anticipation. Soon they would return. They always did, and when they did, I would be waiting, ready to welcome them home. The road stretched endlessly before us, covered in a blanket of snow. But I wasn't afraid anymore. This was where I belonged, in this endless Christmas Eve, with the hitchhiker by my side. I turned back towards the house, our house, where the lights glowed warmly in the windows. Christmas carols drifted on the cold air, a promise of the celebration to come. "Merry Christmas," I whispered to the empty road. And somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of an engine growing closer. The snow crunched under our tires as we pulled up to the isolated mountain cabin. Sarah and I had been planning this quiet Christmas getaway for months, eager to escape the chaos of the city and spend some quality time together. As we stepped out of the car, the crisp mountain air bit at our cheeks, and the silence of the surrounding forest was almost deafening. "This is perfect," Sarah said, her breath visible in the cold air. I nodded, grabbing our bags from the trunk. The cabin looked cozy, a wooden structure nestled among towering pines. It was exactly what we'd hoped for, secluded and peaceful. We trudged through the snow to the front door, fumbling with the key the rental company had provided. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark. I flicked on the lights while Sarah started a fire in the stone fireplace. As the flames grew, casting a warm glow around the room, we began to relax. "I'll unpack the groceries," I said, heading to the kitchen. Sarah nodded, curling up on the couch with a blanket. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect, as it turned out. The first sign that something was off came that night. We'd gone to bed early, exhausted from the drive. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. The silence that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then I heard it, soft footsteps overhead, in the attic. I sat up, straining my ears. Sarah stirred beside me. "What's wrong?" she mumbled, still half asleep. "I heard something," I whispered, "in the attic." Sarah sat up too, listening. The footsteps continued, soft but unmistakable. "It's probably just the house settling," she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I got out of bed, grabbing a flashlight from my bag. "I'm going to check it out." The stairs to the attic creaked under my weight as I climbed. My hands were sweating despite the cold, making the flashlight slippery in my grip. At the top of the stairs, I pushed open the attic door. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating dusty boxes and old furniture. But there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the footsteps we'd heard. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye. In the corner was a cardboard box filled with old Christmas ornaments. On top sat a porcelain doll, its painted eyes staring blankly at me. A chill ran down my spine. I backed out of the attic quickly, shutting the door behind me. Sarah was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale in the dim light. "Did you find anything?" she asked. I shook my head. "Just some old junk, probably mice or something." We went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake for hours, listening for any sound from above. But the attic remained silent. The next morning, we tried to shake off the unease from the night before. We made breakfast, then decided to explore the area around the cabin. The snow had stopped, leaving everything covered in a pristine white blanket. We trudged through the woods, our breaths puffing out in white clouds. When we returned to the cabin a few hours later, cheeks red from the cold, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I saw it. The porcelain doll from the attic was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase. Sarah saw it too. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Did you bring that down?" she asked, her voice shaking. I shook my head, unable to speak. We stood there, staring at the doll, neither of us wanting to touch it. Finally, Sarah stepped forward and picked it up gingerly. "We should put it back," she said. We climbed the attic stairs together this time, but when we opened the door, the box of ornaments was gone. We searched every corner of the small space, but it had vanished. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time they weren't confined to the attic. They moved down the stairs, across the living room, circling our bedroom door. Sarah clung to me, her whole body shaking. I wanted to get up, to confront whatever was out there, but fear kept me rooted to the bed. The doorknob rattled. We held our breaths, watching in horror as it slowly began to turn. But just as it seemed the door would open, everything went silent. The rest of the night passed without incident, but neither of us slept a wink. In the morning light, things seemed less frightening. We tried to rationalize what had happened. Old houses make strange noises. Our imaginations were running wild in the unfamiliar setting. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. We decided to leave. We'd cut our vacation short, head back to the city where things made sense. But as we threw our belongings into our suitcases, a new horror awaited us. The road was gone. Where yesterday there had been a clear path leading down the mountain, now there was only unbroken forest. We stood at the edge of the clearing where we'd parked the car, staring in disbelief at the wall of trees before us. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered. I nodded, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. We walked around the cabin, searching for any sign of the road, but found nothing. It was as if the cabin had always been here, alone in the wilderness. As night fell again, we huddled together in the living room, the fire our only source of comfort. The windows reflected strange, quick-moving shadows, and muffled whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, mimicking Christmas carols in a twisted, off-key way. The fireplace cast dancing shadows around the room, but they didn't match the movements of the flames. They twisted and writhed with a life of their own, forming shapes that made my eyes hurt to look at. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded. There was a presence in the room with us, invisible but undeniably there. It circled us like a predator, the air growing colder wherever it passed. Suddenly, the fire went out, plunging us into darkness. Sarah screamed, and I fumbled for the flashlight. When I finally got it on, the beam illuminated the porcelain doll sitting on the coffee table in front of us. Its painted smile seemed wider than before, its eyes gleaming in the artificial light. We ran to the bedroom, slamming the door behind us. We pushed the dresser in front of it, then huddled together on the bed. The whispers grew louder, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Our breaths came out in visible puffs, and frost began to form on the windows. The night stretched on endlessly. Strange noises echoed through the cabin, the sound of ornaments shattering, of furniture being dragged across floors, of doors slamming open and shut, and always, always, those whispered carols. When dawn finally broke, we were still awake, our bodies stiff from cold and fear. The noises had stopped, and an eerie silence had fallen over the cabin. Slowly, cautiously, we moved the dresser and opened the door. The living room was a wreck. Furniture was overturned, and broken ornaments littered the floor. But what caught our attention was the wall opposite us. There, written in what looked horribly like blood, were the words, "Merry Christmas." We ran. We didn't bother with our belongings, didn't try to find the road. We just ran into the forest, desperate to get away from the cabin and whatever haunted it. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we found ourselves in a small clearing. And there, in the center, was the cabin. We'd run in a straight line, I was sure of it, but somehow we'd ended up right back where we started. Sarah started to cry, deep, racking sobs that shook her whole body. I held her, my own tears freezing on my cheeks, We were trapped, caught in some nightmare that we couldn't escape. As we stood there, the cabin door creaked open. The porcelain doll sat on the threshold, its painted eyes fixed on us. And from inside, we heard the faint strains of Silent Night, played on a music box we'd never seen. We're still here in this endless Christmas nightmare. The days blend together, each bringing new horrors. Sometimes we try to leave, but we always end up back at the cabin. The doll watches us, its smile growing wider with each passing day. The whispers in the walls have become our constant companions. And every night, as the sun sets and the shadows grow long, we huddle together and wonder, will this be the night we finally succumb to the madness? Or will we be forced to endure this twisted Christmas for eternity? I don't know how long we've been here now. Time has lost all meaning. But I know this. If you're reading this, stay away from isolated cabins. Don't seek solitude in the mountains, because sometimes the quiet isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's hiding something far worse than you could ever imagine. And whatever you do, if you see a porcelain doll with a too wide smile and gleaming eyes, run, run, and don't look back. Because Christmas isn't always merry. Sometimes it's a nightmare you can never wake up from. The package felt heavy in my hands as I trudged through the snow-covered streets. It was Christmas Eve, and I was the unlucky delivery guy stuck working the late shift. The city was eerily quiet, most people already tucked away in their homes for the holiday. As I turned onto Maple Street, I noticed something odd. The Christmas lights on the houses seemed dim, almost faded. It was as if the very spirit of the season had been sucked out of this neighborhood. I checked the address on the package again, 1313 Maple Street. My eyes scanned the house numbers until I found it, a dark, undecorated house standing out like a sore thumb among its festive neighbors. I hesitated at the gate, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The package in my hands had no return address, just a plain brown wrapper with the destination scrawled in spidery handwriting. As I approached the front door, the smell hit me, a strong, sickly, sweet odor of rotting pine. I wrinkled my nose, looking around for the source, but there wasn't a Christmas tree in sight. The porch creaked under my feet as I reached for the doorbell. Before I could press it, I heard something that made me freeze. From inside the house came the slow, melodic chiming of a carillon clock, playing a Christmas carol so out of tune it was barely recognizable. My hand hovered over the doorbell, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to leave, to forget about this delivery and go home. But I had a job to do. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The doorbell didn't make a sound. Instead, the package in my hand seemed to vibrate, the brown paper crinkling softly. I nearly dropped it in surprise. What the hell was in this thing? I waited, shifting from foot to foot in the cold. No one came to the door. I was about to ring again when I heard it, the slow creak of hinges. The door was opening by itself. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the door swung wide. Beyond it was a dark, empty hallway. No lights, no decorations, just shadows and that persistent smell of decay. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared even to my own ears. "Package delivery." No response, just the faint echo of my own voice bouncing back at me from the empty house. I should have left then. Should have put the package down and walked away. But something compelled me to step inside. It was like my body was moving of its own accord, drawn by some unseen force. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I entered the hallway. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light revealed peeling wallpaper and dust-covered furniture. It looked like no one had lived here for years. But that was impossible. Someone had ordered this package, right? I made my way deeper into the house, calling out occasionally, but receiving no response. The Carillon clock continued its eerie melody, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As I reached the living room, my flashlight beam fell on something that made my blood run cold. There, in the center of the room, was an ancient Christmas tree. Its branches were bare and twisted, ornaments long since fallen and shattered on the floor, and at the top, where a star or angel should have been, was a human skull. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sick joke, a prank set up to scare delivery guys on Christmas Eve. But as I turned to leave, I realized something terrible. The hallway I had come through was gone. In its place was a solid wall, as if it had always been there. Panic set in. I ran from room to room, searching for a way out. But every window was bricked up. Every door led to another empty, decaying room. It was as if the house was rearranging itself around me, trapping me in an endless maze. The package was still clutched in my hands, feeling heavier with each passing moment. Whatever was inside seemed to be moving now, pulsing like a beating heart. I wanted to drop it, to throw it as far away from me as possible, but my fingers wouldn't release their grip. As I stumbled back into the living room, I noticed something I had missed before. The skull on top of the tree was moving, its jaw opening and closing in time with the carillon's melody. And it was speaking, whispering words I couldn't quite make out. I leaned closer, against my better judgment, straining to hear. And then I wished I hadn't, because what the skull was saying, over and over again, was my name. The package in my hands burst open then, spilling its contents onto the floor. Photographs scattered everywhere, hundreds of them, and in every single one was me. Me as a child, me at school, me at my first job. Even photos from earlier that day, delivering packages around the city. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. But as I sat there, surrounded by images of my own life, the truth began to sink in. This package, this house, they had been waiting for me all along. The Carillon's song grew louder, drowning out the sound of my panicked breathing. The skull's whispers became a chant, my name repeated over and over until it lost all meaning. And still, the house shifted and changed around me, halls appearing and disappearing, rooms rearranging themselves in impossible ways. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed by fear. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this place. But eventually, I forced myself to my feet. I had to find a way out. Had to escape this nightmare before it was too late. I began to run, sprinting through the twisting corridors of the house. Every room I entered was different from the last, yet somehow familiar. A kitchen with rotting food on the table. A bedroom with a child's toys scattered across the floor. A bathroom with rust-stained fixtures and cracked mirrors. And in every room, more photographs. My entire life laid out before me, including moments I had no memory of. Me sleeping in my bed at home. Me walking down the street, unaware I was being watched. Me delivering packages to this very house, over and over again. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had been here before, many times, and each time I had forgotten. How many times had I entered this house, only to become trapped in its nightmarish loop? As I ran, the house seemed to come alive around me. Walls pulsed like living flesh, floors rippled under my feet. The photographs on the walls began to move, the images of myself turning to watch me as I passed. And always, always, that damned carillon clock kept playing its twisted melody. I lost all sense of direction, of up and down, of reality itself. The house had become a living thing, and I was trapped inside its guts, running through arteries and veins that led nowhere. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when I was ready to collapse and give in to the madness, I saw it. A door. Plain and unassuming, it stood at the end of a long hallway, and beyond it, I could see a sliver of the night sky. Hope surged through me. I ran towards it, my legs burning with effort. The house seemed to fight against me, the hallway stretching impossibly long, but I pushed on, driven by desperation and the need to escape. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers closing around it. For a moment, I thought it wouldn't turn, that this final hope would be snatched away. But then it moved, the door swinging open. Cold night air hit my face, and I nearly cried with relief. I stumbled out onto the street, gasping for breath. Behind me, I heard the door slam shut. I turned to look back at the house, half expecting it to have disappeared. But it was still there, dark and foreboding. The only difference was a package on the doorstep, my package, rewrapped and waiting for the next delivery. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I found myself back on a main street. Cars passed by. People walked on the sidewalks, oblivious to the horror I had just experienced. I've tried to tell people what happened, the police, my boss, even my family. But no one believes me. They say I must have fallen asleep on the job, that it was all a vivid nightmare. But I know the truth. That house is out there, waiting, and someday it will call for another delivery, another unsuspecting victim to trap in its endless, nightmarish loop. So if you're ever asked to make a delivery to 1313 Maple Street, don't go. Don't even think about it, because once you enter that house, you might never truly leave. The game will just begin again and again and again, forever. Key turned in the lock with a satisfying click. I pushed open the door to my new apartment, breathing in the musty air of a space that had been unoccupied for months. It was Christmas Eve, and while most people were gathering with family and friends, I had chosen to spend it alone in my new place. A fresh start, I told myself, away from the chaos and expectations of the holiday season. I flicked on the lights, illuminating the bare walls and empty rooms. The apartment was small but cozy, perfect for a single person starting over in the city. I dragged my suitcase inside and shut the door behind me, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. No family drama, no forced small talk, just me and my own company. As I unpacked my few belongings, I could hear the muffled sounds of Christmas music and laughter from neighboring apartments. It seemed I was the only one in the building not celebrating. The thought didn't bother me as much as I expected it to. Night fell quickly, and I found myself sitting on the floor of my empty living room, eating takeout Chinese food straight from the container. The city lights twinkled outside my window, a poor substitute for Christmas decorations. I was just about to call it a night when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside my door. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was probably just one of my neighbors coming home late. But then I remembered all my neighbors had left for the holidays. The building manager had mentioned it when I moved in, saying I'd have the place practically to myself for the first few days. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. They seemed to pause right outside my door. My heart rate picked up, and I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any other sound. For a long moment, There was nothing but silence. Then, without warning, the lights in the hallway began to flicker. I could see the erratic flashing through the crack under my door. The footsteps started again, moving away from my apartment and then back again, as if someone was pacing. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky beneath me. Should I look? Should I call someone? Before I could decide, a shadow passed in front of my door, blocking out the flickering light for a brief moment. I stumbled backward, my heart now pounding in my chest. The intercom buzzed, making me jump. I approached it cautiously, my hand hovering over the receiver. After a moment's hesitation, I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, I heard it, my own name, whispered back to me in a voice I didn't recognize. I dropped the receiver as if it had burned me, backing away from the intercom. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of prank, right? A sick joke played on the new tenant. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something wrong here, something that went beyond a simple practical joke. I turned towards the kitchen, intending to grab a knife or something to defend myself with. That's when I saw them. Photographs stuck to my refrigerator. Photographs that hadn't been there when I'd gotten my takeout earlier. My hands shook as I approached, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. They were photos of me walking down the street, me sitting in a cafe, me unlocking the door to this very apartment. Some were from today, others from weeks ago, and I hadn't taken any of them. Panic seized me. I ran to the door, fumbling with the lock, desperate to get out. But when I flung it open, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. The hallway outside my apartment was gone. In its place was a corridor that stretched impossibly long in both directions, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. This wasn't possible. I was on the 5th floor of an apartment building in the middle of the city. There couldn't be a hallway like that outside my door. The intercom buzzed again, more insistent this time. I ignored it, instead moving to the window. Maybe I could signal for help, get someone's attention on the street below. But when I looked out, all I saw was darkness. Impenetrable, absolute darkness where the city should have been. A knock at the door made me spin around. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. Then it came again, louder this time, and again, increasing in intensity until it was a constant thunderous pounding that shook the entire apartment. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting around for any means of escape. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind a silence so complete it was almost deafening. Then I heard it, the sound of a key turning in the lock. My key, the one I had in my pocket. The door swung open slowly, revealing the impossible hallway beyond. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was me, or something that looked like me, wearing the same clothes I had on. But its face was wrong, blank, featureless, like a mannequin's. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat before I could stop it. The figure tilted its head, a grotesque parody of curiosity. Then it stepped into the apartment, the door swinging shut behind it. I ran to the bedroom, slamming the door and pushing the dresser in front of it. I could hear footsteps following me, slow and unhurried. They stopped outside the bedroom door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then a soft tapping on the door. Tap, 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 like someone politely asking to be let in. I looked around wildly, searching for a way out. The window caught my eye. Maybe I could signal for help, or even climb out onto the fire escape. I rushed over, pulling back the curtains. But there was no window, just a blank wall where the window should have been. The tapping at the door continued, growing more insistent. I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. I closed my eyes tightly, willing myself to wake up. When I opened them again, the room had changed. The walls were covered in more photographs, hundreds of them, all of me. Every moment of my life seemed to be captured there, including moments I had no memory of. Me sleeping in my bed, me brushing my teeth, me sitting in this very room. The tapping at the door had stopped. Instead, I heard the sound of something being slid under the door. A photograph. In it, I saw myself, sitting exactly as I was now, looking at the camera with an expression of absolute terror. The door began to open, the dresser sliding across the floor as if it weighed nothing. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch as the door swung wide, revealing the figure that looked like me, but wasn't. It stepped into the room, its blank face turned towards me. And then, slowly, a mouth began to form on that featureless visage. It opened, wider and wider, until it was an impossibly large, gaping maw. And from it came a sound, the chiming of bells, like an old church on Christmas Eve. The sound grew louder and louder, drowning out my screams, filling the room, the apartment, the entire world. I don't know how long I sat there, trapped in that nightmare. Hours, days, maybe even years. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. But eventually, something changed. The chiming of the bells faded, replaced by a different sound, the beeping of an alarm clock. I opened my eyes to find myself in my old bedroom, in my parents' house. Sunlight streamed through the window, and I could hear the sounds of my family downstairs, getting ready for Christmas morning. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It had all been a dream, a terrible nightmare brought on by stress and too much late-night Chinese food. But then I noticed something on my nightstand, a photograph I had never seen before. In it, I saw myself sitting in an empty room, surrounded by hundreds of other photos, my face a mask of terror. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it hadn't been a dream at all. That somewhere out there, in some twisted version of reality, a part of me was still trapped in that apartment, still running from something that wore my face, still listening to the endless chiming of those terrible bells. I've never told anyone about what happened that Christmas Eve. Who would believe me? But every year, as the holidays approach, I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the locks on my doors and windows, and I wonder, with a fear that never quite goes away, if this will be the year it happens again. If this will be the year I find myself back in that apartment, facing a horror that wears my own face. Because now I know the truth, that sometimes the most terrifying things aren't the monsters under our beds or the shadows in the dark. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is ourselves, and the realization that we might not be as alone as we think we are, even when we're completely, utterly alone. The bus engine rumbled beneath my feet as I settled into my seat. It was Christmas Eve, and I was on the last bus out of town, heading to my parents' house for the holidays. The snow was falling heavily outside, blanketing the world in white. I checked my watch, 11:30 p.m. If all went well, I'd make it home just after midnight. As the bus pulled away from the station, I noticed how empty it was. Only a handful of other passengers were scattered throughout, most of them dozing or staring blankly out the windows. All except for one man at the back, wearing a bright red coat that stood out starkly against the drab interior of the bus. I tried to relax, letting the gentle sway of the bus lull me into a sense of calm. But something felt off. The man in the red coat was humming, just loud enough for me to hear. The tune was familiar, but distorted somehow, like a Christmas carol played at the wrong speed. The first stop came and went. Nobody got off, and nobody got on. I frowned, checking the route map. We should have picked up at least a few more passengers. The bus felt emptier now, though I couldn't say why. As we continued down the snowy highway, I noticed the radio wasn't working. The driver kept fiddling with it, but all that came through was static. Occasionally, I thought I heard snippets of music or voices, but they were gone as quickly as they appeared. I checked my phone, hoping to distract myself with some mindless scrolling. No signal. The screen showed only the time, 12:15 a.m., Christmas Day. I should have felt excited, but instead, a sense of unease crept over me. The humming from the back of the bus grew louder. I turned to look at the man in the red coat, but his face was hidden in shadow. The other passengers seemed oblivious to him, their faces slack and unmoving. Another stop. This time, I was sure the bus had been fuller before. Where had the other passengers gone? I hadn't seen anyone get off. The driver didn't seem to notice or care, continuing to drive in silence. I stood up, intending to ask the driver what was going on. As I made my way to the front of the bus, I realized the scenery outside hadn't changed. The same twisted tree kept appearing over and over again, as if we were driving in a loop. "Excuse me," I said to the driver, my voice shaking slightly. "I think we might be lost." The driver didn't respond. He didn't even blink, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I returned to my seat, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of dream or hallucination. I pinched myself hard, but nothing changed. The humming stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard the man in the red coat stand up. His footsteps echoed through the bus as he made his way towards the front. I kept my eyes forward, afraid to look at him. He passed by my seat, and I caught a whiff of peppermint and decay. From the corner of my eye, I saw his red coat, now looking more like it was drenched in something darker than dye. The bus door opened with a hiss, even though we were still moving. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the sound of bells. Not cheerful Christmas bells, but a deep, ominous tolling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I looked up, unable to stop myself. The man in the red coat stood by the open door, his back to me. Slowly, he turned his head. His face. It wasn't a face at all, just a swirling void where features should have been. I screamed, the sound torn from my throat by sheer terror. But no one reacted. The other passengers sat motionless, like mannequins. The driver continued to stare ahead, guiding us through an endless loop of snowy roads. The man, if he could be called that, stepped off the bus into the swirling snow. The door closed behind him, but the tolling of the bells continued. I ran to the front of the bus, grabbing the driver's shoulder. "Stop the bus!" I yelled. "We have to get out of here." The driver's head swiveled towards me, his movements jerky and unnatural. His eyes were blank, pupil-less orbs. His mouth opened, but instead of words, more of that staticky radio noise came out. I stumbled backwards, falling into a seat. The other passengers began to turn towards me, their faces melting away to reveal the same void as the man in the red coat. The bus lurched, picking up speed. Outside, the snowy landscape blurred into a white void. The tolling of the bells grew louder, drowning out my panicked breaths. I closed my eyes, praying to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them again, I was alone on the bus. The driver, the other passengers, all gone. Just empty seats and the endless white outside the windows. The bus kept driving itself, plowing through the snow towards some unknown destination. I tried the emergency exit, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Hours seemed to pass, or maybe it was just minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The bus radio crackled to life, playing distorted Christmas carols that sounded more like screams than songs. Suddenly, the bus screeched to a halt. The doors opened with a hiss. Outside, I saw a twisted version of my parents' house, decorated with lights that blinked in unsettling patterns. A figure stood on the porch, the man in the red coat. He raised a hand, beckoning me to come out. I shook my head, pressing myself against the back of my seat, but my body began to move of its own accord, standing up and walking towards the door. As I stepped off the bus, the world around me shifted. The house disappeared, replaced by an endless field of snow. The man in the red coat stood before me, his void face swirling with flecks of light like distant stars. "Welcome home," a voice echoed in my head. It sounded like my voice, but wrong somehow, as if played backwards. The bus vanished behind me. I was alone with the figure in the snowy wasteland. The tolling of the bells reached a crescendo, and I felt myself falling into that starry void where the man's face should have been. I jolted awake with a gasp. I was on a bus, but a normal one this time. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the other passengers were going about their business as usual. "Last stop, buddy," the driver called out. "Merry Christmas." I stumbled off the bus, disoriented. Had it all been a dream? It had felt so real. As I walked towards my parents' house, snow crunching under my feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The Christmas decorations seemed too bright, the carols from nearby houses too cheery. I reached the front door and raised my hand to knock. That's when I saw it. A red thread caught on my sleeve, a thread the exact color of that coat from my nightmare. The door opened before I could knock. My mother stood there, smiling widely, too widely. Behind her I could see my father and siblings gathered around the Christmas tree. They turned to look at me in unison, their faces blank and expectant. "Welcome home," my mother said, her voice echoing strangely. "We've been waiting for you." As I stepped into the house, I heard it faintly in the distance, the tolling of bells, and I knew with a sinking feeling in my gut that my journey wasn't over, that perhaps it had only just begun. The door closed behind me with a final sounding click. The Christmas tree lights blinked in that unsettling pattern I remembered from my dream. My family's smiles never wavered, never reached their eyes. "Merry Christmas," they said in unison, their voices overlapping in a discordant chorus. I wanted to run, to scream, to wake up from this new nightmare, but I couldn't move. I could only stand there as my family surrounded me, their features beginning to blur and swirl like the face of the man in the red coat. The last thing I saw before the world faded to white was a bus outside the window, its destination board reading "Forever" in flickering letters. And I realized, as the tolling of the bells grew louder, that I was trapped in an endless Christmas Eve, doomed to relive this nightmare over and over again. The bus would always be waiting, the journey would always be the same, and I would always end up here, in this twisted version of home. So if you're ever on a late-night bus on Christmas Eve and you see a man in a red coat humming strange tunes, don't ignore it, don't fall asleep, and whatever you do, don't get off at the last stop, because sometimes the journey home is a one-way trip to somewhere you can never leave. The key felt cold in my hand. as I stood on the porch of my childhood home. It had been years since I'd been back, but here I was on Christmas Eve, about to spend the holiday alone in a house full of memories. I took a deep breath and pushed the key into the lock, the click echoing in the quiet night. As I stepped inside, the musty smell of disuse hit me. The house had been empty since my parents passed away, and it showed. Dust covered every surface, and sheets draped the furniture like ghosts of Christmases past. I flicked on the lights, half expecting them not to work, but the old wiring held up. I made my way through the living room, my footsteps creaking on the hardwood floors. Family photos lined the walls, faces I hadn't seen in years staring back at me. As I passed by, I could have sworn one of the pictures changed. My father's smile seemed to widen, his eyes following me as I moved. I shook my head, blaming it on fatigue from the long drive. In the kitchen, I found an old box of decorations. Might as well make the place a bit festive, I thought. As I hung tinsel and ornaments, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone standing there. But the house remained empty and silent. It was when I went to put the angel on top of the tree that I noticed it was missing. I distinctly remembered packing it, but it wasn't in the box. Odd, but not alarming. Things get lost all the time, right? As night fell, the wind picked up outside. Tree branches scraped against the windows, sounding unsettlingly like fingernails on glass. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on making a cup of hot chocolate in the kitchen. That's when I heard it. A child's voice, faint but clear, calling my name from upstairs. My mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. There were no children in this house. There hadn't been for decades. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response, just the wind and the creaking of the old house. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Each step seemed to groan under my weight, announcing my presence to whatever might be waiting above. The upstairs hallway was dark, the shadows seeming to move in the corners of my vision. Again, I heard my name. It was coming from my old bedroom. The door was closed, just as I had left it earlier. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch. I pushed the door open, revealing my childhood bedroom exactly as it had been when I left for college all those years ago. Posters on the walls, trophies on the shelves, and my old twin bed in the corner. But something was different. On the bed sat a porcelain doll I'd never seen before, its painted eyes fixed on me. A chill ran down my spine. I backed out of the room quickly, slamming the door shut. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I ran downstairs, heading for the front door. I needed to get out, to call someone, anyone. But as I reached for the handle, the old rotary phone in the hallway began to ring. Its shrill tone cut through the silence of the house, making me jump. Against my better judgment, I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Static crackled on the line. Then, faintly, I heard laughter. Children's laughter, mixed with a deeper, more sinister chuckle. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. I turned back to the front door, but froze in my tracks. There, at the bottom of the stairs, sat the porcelain doll from my bedroom. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, that painted smile seeming wider than before. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked hard, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I opened my eyes, the doll was still there. And now, ever so slowly, its head was turning towards me. I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away. I found myself in the living room, surrounded by those old family photos. But now, every face in every picture was distorted, mouths open in silent screams, eyes pitch black and staring. The Christmas tree lights began to flicker, casting strange shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The ornaments rattled on their branches, though there was no breeze. And from the top of the tree, where the angel should have been, two glowing red eyes stared down at me. I backed away, bumping into the old grandfather clock in the corner. It sprang to life, the pendulum swinging wildly, the hands spinning backwards. Suddenly it struck midnight, the chimes echoing through the house like a funeral toll. With each chime, the room seemed to shift and change. The wallpaper peeled away, revealing rotting wood beneath. The furniture aged decades in seconds, upholstery tearing, wood splintering. And with the final chime, every light in the house went out. I stood in total darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the pounding of my heart. Then I smelled it. The scent of Christmas cookies and pine, just like when I was a kid. For a moment, I felt a flicker of comfort, but that comfort was short-lived, because mixed with those familiar scents was something else, something rotten and decayed, the smell of time gone by, of memories turned sour. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, straining to see in the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. No answer came. Instead, I felt a cold hand grasp my shoulder. I jerked away, stumbling backwards until I hit the wall. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw them. Shadows, darker than the darkness around them, moving towards me. They had no definite shape, constantly shifting and changing, but I could feel their malevolence. I closed my eyes tight, praying for this nightmare to end. When I opened them again, the lights were back on. The room looked normal, no sign of decay or distortion. For a moment I thought it had all been in my head. Then I saw the mirror hanging on the wall. In it, I could see my reflection, but I wasn't alone. Behind me stood a figure, tall and imposing, wearing a Santa Claus costume. But this wasn't the jolly Saint Nick of Christmas cards. This Santa's eyes were hollow pits, his smile too wide, filled with sharp teeth. He raised a hand, waving at me in the mirror. I whirled around, but there was no one there, just me, alone in the room. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. But now my own reflection was wrong. My face was gaunt, my eyes sunken. I looked like I had aged decades in minutes. The house groaned around me, the walls seeming to pulse like a living thing. From upstairs came the sound of childish laughter, followed by the patter of small feet running across the floor. The porcelain doll appeared at the top of the stairs, its head rotating in a full circle. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran for the front door, yanking it open. But instead of the porch and the street beyond, I was met with a solid brick wall. I tried the back door, the windows, every possible exit. All of them were blocked, sealed, trapping me inside. The laughter grew louder, coming from every room now. The temperature dropped rapidly, my breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. Ice crystals formed on the windows, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like faces in agony. The Christmas tree erupted in flames, the fire spreading impossibly fast. But instead of heat, it radiated intense cold. The flames were blue and white, turning everything they touched to ice. I huddled in a corner, watching in horror as my childhood home transformed into a frozen hell. The walls bled ice, icicles growing like teeth from the ceiling. And through it all, that laughter continued, now accompanied by the tolling of bells. As the ice crept towards me, encasing everything in its path, I saw them, my family, my parents, my siblings, even relatives long dead. They stood among the flames, their faces a mixture of joy and terror. They reached out to me, beckoning me to join them. "Merry Christmas," they said in unison, their voices echoing strangely. "Welcome home." The ice reached my feet, beginning to climb up my legs. I tried to move, to break free, but I was frozen in place. As the cold crept up my body, I realized the truth. I had never left this house. I had never grown up, never moved away. I had been here all along, trapped in an endless loop of Christmas Eve horrors. The last thing I saw before the ice covered my eyes was the porcelain doll, now life-sized, standing over me. It leaned in close, its painted lips brushing against my ear. "Don't worry," it whispered in a voice that was both childish and ancient. "You'll get another chance next Christmas. You always do." As consciousness faded, I heard the chiming of the grandfather clock. Midnight, Christmas Day, and the nightmare would begin again, as it always had, as it always would. Forever. The SUV's tires crunched on the gravel road as we approached the remote cabin. It was Christmas Eve, and my friends and I had decided to get away from the city for a quiet holiday celebration. As we lost cell signal, the dense forest closed in around us, making the world feel smaller and more isolated. "This is it," I said, pulling up to a rustic wooden structure. It looked cozy enough, with smoke curling from the chimney and warm light spilling from the windows. We piled out of the car, stretching after the long drive. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Sarah, and our college buddies Mike and Lisa. We'd been planning this getaway for months, eager for a break from our hectic lives. As we unloaded our bags, I noticed something odd. Hanging from the trees surrounding the cabin were Christmas ornaments, but they didn't look store-bought. They seemed to be made of intricately woven strands of something. I squinted in the fading light, trying to get a better look. "Hey guys, check this out," I called to the others. Jake came over, frowning as he examined the ornaments. "Are those made of hair?" he asked, his voice tinged with disgust. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I reached out to touch one, but Sarah's voice stopped me. "Don't," she said sharply. "Let's just get inside. It's freezing out here." We hurried into the cabin, the warmth from the fireplace a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. The interior was cozy, all wood paneling and plush furniture. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with normal, non-creepy ornaments. Mike found an old radio and turned it on. A scratchy, melancholic version of Silent Night filled the room. It was oddly muffled, as if the singers were underwater. "Well, this is festive," Lisa said, trying to lighten the mood. We settled in, unpacking our supplies and preparing for a late dinner. The strange ornaments outside were temporarily forgotten as we focused on food and conversation. But as the night wore on, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The cabin creaked and groaned in the wind, and shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. The cabin had 3 bedrooms, one for Jake and Sarah, one for Mike and Lisa, and one for me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A loud crack from outside made me bolt upright. It sounded like a branch breaking, but much closer than the nearest tree should have been. I listened intently, but heard nothing else. Just as I was about to lie back down, I heard it again. Another crack, followed by what sounded like footsteps crunching in the snow. Heart pounding, I got up and went to the window. The full moon illuminated the clearing around the cabin, casting everything in a pale, ghostly light. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. There was nothing there, but as I turned away, something caught my eye. One of the hair ornaments was swaying gently, despite there being no wind. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as my mind conjured up increasingly terrifying scenarios. When morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. Surely things would seem less ominous in the daylight, but as we gathered for breakfast, it became clear that I wasn't the only one who'd had a rough night. Everyone looked tired and on edge. Mike, in particular, seemed pale and shaken. "You okay, man?" I asked him as he poured himself a large cup of coffee. He shook his head. "I went for a walk in the woods early this morning," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw something. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't right." Before I could ask him to elaborate, Sarah interrupted. "Did anyone else hear that weird chanting last night? It sounded like it was coming from the woods." A heavy silence fell over the room. We all looked at each other, realization dawning that something very strange was happening. Jake was the first to break the silence. "Okay, let's not jump to conclusions. This is an old cabin in the woods. It's bound to make weird noises. And Mike, you were probably just tired and imagined things." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. None of us were convinced by his rational explanations. We tried to salvage the day, to focus on our original plans of hiking and enjoying nature. But an oppressive atmosphere had settled over us. Every sound from the forest made us jump. Every shadow seemed to hide some lurking threat. As evening approached, the strange occurrences intensified. The radio, which had been silent all day, suddenly crackled to life. Instead of music, it emitted a series of harsh, guttural sounds that might have been words in some unknown language. Lisa screamed and unplugged it, but the sounds continued for several seconds before abruptly cutting off. We huddled together in the living room, all pretense of holiday cheer abandoned. The fireplace, which had been roaring all day, suddenly went out, plunging us into near darkness. As Jake struggled to relight it, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, soft, rhythmic thumps coming from the roof, like footsteps. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Right now." No one argued. We scrambled to pack our things, moving with frantic energy. But as we opened the front door, ready to make a run for the car, we were met with a sight that stopped us in our tracks. The clearing around the cabin was filled with figures. They stood motionless, facing the cabin. In the moonlight, I could see that they were wearing robes made of the same material as the ornaments, human hair, woven into intricate patterns. Their faces were hidden in the shadows of deep hoods. We slammed the door shut, our escape plan thwarted. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. "The back door," Mike suggested, already moving towards it. But when he opened it, we were met with the same sight. More robed figures, standing silent and still. Hours passed, though it felt like days. We took turns watching the windows, but the figures never moved. They just stood there, waiting. The air in the cabin grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Strange whispers seemed to come from the walls, speaking words we couldn't understand, but that filled us with dread. As midnight approached, the whispers grew louder. The hair ornaments on the trees outside began to glow with an eerie, pulsing light. And then, as the old grandfather clock in the corner struck 12, everything went silent. The robed figures outside began to move. Slowly, in perfect unison, they raised their arms towards the sky. A low chant began, growing louder with each passing second. The very air seemed to vibrate with the sound. Inside the cabin, objects began to move on their own. Chairs slid across the floor. Pictures fell from the walls. The Christmas tree shook violently, its ornaments shattering as they hit the ground. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The figures lowered their arms. The objects in the cabin settled. An unnatural stillness fell over everything. We stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. Minutes ticked by, each second feeling like an eternity. And then, without warning, the front door swung open. A single figure stood in the doorway, taller than the others. It reached up and lowered its hood, revealing a face that was both familiar and horrifyingly wrong. It was my face, but twisted and inhuman, with eyes that glowed like embers and a mouth full of sharp teeth. It spoke, its voice a grotesque parody of my own. "Welcome home," it said. "We've been waiting for you." As if pulled by invisible strings, we began to move towards the door. I tried to resist, to turn and run, but my body wouldn't obey. I watched in helpless horror as my friends walked past me, their eyes blank and unseeing. As I crossed the threshold, the world around me began to shift and blur. The clearing, the cabin, the forest, all of it melted away like a bad dream. In its place was nothing, an endless void filled with swirling colors and shapes that hurt to look at. The thing wearing my face grinned, its teeth gleaming in light that had no source. "The celebration is about to begin," it said. "Merry Christmas." And as I felt myself being pulled into that impossible void, I realized with a final, terrible clarity that this Christmas would never end, that we were trapped in a loop of horror that would repeat itself over and over for all eternity. So if you're ever tempted to rent a remote cabin for Christmas, think twice, because sometimes the quiet isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's hiding something far worse than you could ever imagine. And once you're caught in its web, there's no escape, only an endless Christmas nightmare playing out again and again, forever. The bus lurched to a stop, jolting me awake. I blinked, disoriented, as I peered out the frost-covered window. The sign read, "Welcome to Millbrook," my hometown, though it hardly felt like it after so many years away. I grabbed my bag and stepped off the bus into the biting cold of a Christmas Eve night. The town looked exactly as I remembered it, almost eerily so. Christmas lights twinkled on every house, but they seemed dimmer somehow, as if struggling against the encroaching darkness. The old boarding house loomed before me, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the modern buildings that had sprung up around it. I'd booked a room here on a whim, drawn by nostalgia and the need for a quiet place to spend the holidays. As I approached the front door, it swung open. An elderly woman stood there, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp and alert. "You must be Sarah," she said, her voice raspy. "I'm Mrs. Henley. Come in, you're just in time." I stepped inside, the warmth a welcome relief from the cold. The interior was cluttered with antiques, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs and old wood. "In time for what?" I asked, setting my bag down. Mrs. Henley's smile faltered for a moment. "Oh, nothing, dear. Just an old woman's ramblings. Now let me show you to your room." She led me up a creaking staircase to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in places. She stopped at a door near the end, fumbling with a large ring of keys. "Here we are," she said, pushing the door open. "Mind you don't go out after midnight. That's when, well, never mind. Sleep tight, dear." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hall. The room was small but cozy, dominated by a large four-poster bed. A window looked out onto a narrow alley, dark and uninviting. I unpacked quickly, my stomach growling. I hadn't eaten since leaving the city. As I headed back downstairs, I heard Mrs. Henley's voice from the parlor. She seemed to be talking to someone, her tone urgent and low. The night when no one should go out. You know that as well as I do. I peered around the corner, but the room was empty save for Mrs. Henley, standing by the fireplace. She turned suddenly, her eyes meeting mine. For a moment, her face looked different, older, almost skeletal. Then she blinked, and she was just a harmless old lady again. "Oh, Sarah dear, did you need something?" I swallowed hard, my heart racing. I was just wondering if there was somewhere nearby to get dinner. She shook her head vigorously. "Oh, no, dear. Everything's closed for the holiday. But don't worry. I've prepared a nice meal for us. It'll be ready soon." I nodded, retreating to my room. As I closed the door, I heard it again, Mrs. Henley's voice, but this time it seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear against the peeling wallpaper, straining to hear. "She doesn't know. We can't let her find out. Not yet." A chill ran down my spine. What was going on in this house? Dinner was a quiet affair. Mrs. Henley watched me eat with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The food tasted off, though I couldn't put my finger on why. As I finished, the old grandfather clock in the hall began to chime. Midnight. Mrs. Henley's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "Quick, dear, to your room. And whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't open your door until morning." I wanted to ask why, but the look of sheer terror on her face stopped me. I hurried upstairs, locking my door behind me. For a long while, nothing happened. The house creaked and settled, but that was normal for an old building. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, the sound of church bells, though there was no church nearby. The bells tolled, loud and ominous, seeming to shake the very foundations of the house. And then, cutting through the sound, came voices, childish voices, singing a twisted version of a Christmas carol I couldn't quite place. I pressed myself against the door, my ear to the wood. The voices were coming closer, moving up the stairs. They were calling my name, using a nickname I hadn't heard since I was a child. "Sarah Bear," they sang. "Come out and play, Sarah Bear." My breath caught in my throat. How did they know that name? Only my parents had ever called me that. The doorknob rattled. I jumped back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The rattling stopped, replaced by scratching, as if something with claws was trying to get in. I backed away from the door, bumping into the bedside table. The lamp fell, the bulb shattering on impact. In the sudden darkness, the scratching seemed even louder. A new sound joined the chorus, heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs. The childish voices fell silent. "Sarah," a deep voice called. It sounded like my father, but wrong somehow, as if someone was doing a poor imitation of him. "Sarah, honey, it's time to come home." I bit back a scream. My father had died when I was 10. This couldn't be happening. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I could see a shadow beneath it, blocking out the faint light from the hall. "Open the door, Sarah," the voice that wasn't my father said. "Don't you want to see your family?" I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for this nightmare to end. The door began to shake, the wood groaning under some immense pressure. Any moment now, it would splinter and break, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The shadow disappeared. The house fell silent. I didn't move for hours, too terrified to even breathe loudly. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, I finally relaxed. Whatever had happened in the night was over. I opened my door cautiously, half expecting to see claw marks or worse. But the hallway was normal, showing no signs of the previous night's terror. Mrs. Henley was in the kitchen, humming as she made breakfast. She smiled when she saw me, as if nothing had happened. "Sleep well, dear?" she asked, setting a plate of eggs in front of me. I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Had she not heard anything, or was she choosing to ignore it? "Mrs. Henley," I said slowly, "what happened last night?" Her smile faltered. "Last night? Why, nothing happened, dear. It was a quiet Christmas Eve, as always." But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, fear. Before I could press further, she turned away, busying herself at the sink. I ate quickly, desperate to leave this place. As I packed my bag, I noticed something on the bedside table that hadn't been there before, an old photograph. It showed a family standing in front of this very house, a mother, a father, and a little girl with pigtails. My family, me. But that was impossible. I'd never lived in this town as a child. Had I? With shaking hands, I shoved the photo into my pocket and ran downstairs. Mrs. Henley was waiting by the door. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, her voice sad. "We were hoping you'd stay. The others so wanted to see you again." I pushed past her, out into the cold morning air. The street was deserted, the Christmas decorations looking faded and old in the harsh light of day. As I walked to the bus station, a horrible realization began to dawn on me. The town hadn't changed in all these years because it wasn't real. None of this was real. I turned back to look at the boarding house one last time. Mrs. Henley stood on the porch, but she wasn't alone anymore. Next to her were two figures, a man and a woman. My parents. They waved at me, their faces expressionless. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached. When I finally stopped gasping for breath, I found myself at the edge of town. But there was no road leading out, no fields or forests beyond. Just an impenetrable wall of fog. The bus station, when I reached it, was abandoned. Rust-covered signs announced departures to places that didn't exist. And there, on the bench, was my suitcase. The one I'd packed for this trip. The one I thought I'd left in the city. I sank to my knees, the truth finally sinking in. I had never left. I had never grown up, never moved away. I had been here all along, trapped in this twisted version of my hometown, reliving the same nightmare Christmas over and over again. As the fog rolled in, obscuring the town, I heard it again. Those childish voices, calling my name, calling me home. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that when the fog lifted, it would be Christmas Eve again, and the nightmare would start all over. So if you ever find yourself drawn to your hometown for the holidays, be careful. Because sometimes going home isn't a journey. Sometimes it's a trap you might never escape. Cold bit through my coat as Sarah and I stepped into the park. It was Christmas night, and we were looking for a quiet moment away from the chaos of family gatherings. The city park was deserted, illuminated only by the glow of holiday lights strung along the paths. "This is nice," Sarah said, her breath visible in the frigid air. I nodded, pulling her closer as we walked. The decorative lights flickered irregularly, casting strange shadows across the snow-covered ground. I frowned, noticing how the colors seemed off, too bright in some places, eerily dim in others. The effect was disorienting, making the familiar park feel alien and unwelcoming. We approached the frozen lake at the center of the park. The ice reflected the chaotic light display, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope effect on its surface. I felt a wave of vertigo and looked away quickly. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her grip on my arm tightening. I listened intently. At first, all I could hear was our own breathing, unnaturally loud in the stillness of the night. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound. Breathing, but not ours. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and afraid even to my own ears. No response came, but the breathing grew louder. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah tugged at my sleeve. "Let's go," she said, her voice trembling. This was a bad idea. I nodded, turning to leave. That's when I saw her, a small figure sitting alone on a park bench. A child, no more than 7 or 8, wearing a thin dress despite the freezing temperature. She was singing softly, a Christmas carol that sounded wrong somehow, the notes discordant and unsettling. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, taking a step towards her. Sarah's hand on my arm stopped me. "Don't," she hissed. "Something's not right." The girl's head snapped up at the sound of my voice. Her eyes, when they met mine, were unnaturally bright, seeming to glow in the flickering light. She smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous for a child's mouth. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. Sarah and I turned to run, but our feet seemed to move in slow motion, as if we were wading through molasses instead of air. When I looked back, the girl was gone. The bench sat empty, no footprints in the snow to show she had ever been there. "What the hell is going on?" I gasped, finally finding my voice. Sarah shook her head, her face pale with fear. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here, now." We hurried towards the park exit, our feet crunching loudly in the snow. The sound seemed amplified in the unnatural silence, echoing off the trees and frozen lake. With each step, I felt like we were announcing our presence to whatever was out there in the darkness. Suddenly, the air around us grew heavy and acrid. It felt thick in my lungs, making each breath a struggle. Invisible footsteps began to circle us, the snow crunching under the weight of something we couldn't see. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened painfully. "Run," she whispered. We took off, sprinting down the path towards the park gates. But with each turn, the exit seemed to get further away. The path twisted and changed, leading us deeper into the park instead of out. The Christmas lights began to form strange patterns on the ground, geometric shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. They pulsed and shifted, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. "Look," Sarah cried, pointing towards the center of the frozen lake. I followed her gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, standing motionless on the ice, was a group of figures. They were too far away to make out clearly, but something about their stillness, their silent observation, filled me with a deep, primal fear. "Who are they?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. As if in response to my question, the figures began to move, not towards us, but in a slow, synchronous dance on the ice. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unseen puppeteer. The air grew colder, if that was even possible. My breath came out in rapid, visible puffs as panic set in. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination or shared delusion. Sarah tugged at my arm. "The exit," she said, her voice hoarse with fear. "I can see it." Sure enough, the park gates were visible in the distance. We ran towards them, our legs burning with the effort. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The gates were changing, morphing before our eyes. They grew taller, the iron twisting into grotesque shapes that looked like screaming faces. We skidded to a stop just short of the gates. Beyond them, where the city street should have been, there was only darkness, an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow all light and sound. "No," Sarah moaned. "This can't be happening." I turned, hoping to find another way out, but froze at what I saw. The group from the lake was closer now, close enough to see that they weren't people at all. They were shapes that only approximated human form, their features blurred and shifting constantly. One of them raised an arm, pointing at us. The others followed suit, their limbs moving in perfect unison. And then, as one, they began to glide towards us, their feet never touching the ground. Panic overwhelmed me. I grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her towards the twisted gates. "We have to go through," I said, my voice shaking. "It's our only chance." She nodded, her face a mask of terror. Together we stepped forward into the darkness beyond the gates. For a moment there was nothing, no sight, no sound, not even the feeling of ground beneath our feet. Then, slowly, the world began to fade back into existence. We were standing at the entrance to the park. The Christmas lights twinkled normally. The paths were clear and straight. Everything looked as it should. Did we imagine all that?" Sarah asked, her voice small and uncertain. I shook my head, unable to speak, because there, sitting on a bench near the entrance, was the little girl. She smiled and waved at us, her two bright eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Merry Christmas," she called, her voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet night. "See you next year." We ran. We ran until we reached the safety of my apartment, locking the door behind us and collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. Days passed, and we tried to convince ourselves it had all been some sort of shared hallucination. Too much eggnog, maybe, or bad Christmas turkey. But deep down, we knew the truth, because now, every night, I see them in my dreams, the figures on the ice, dancing their unnatural dance. The little girl with her sharp-toothed smile, and always, always, the feeling that they're waiting for us to return. So if you're ever tempted to take a quiet walk in the park on Christmas night, think twice, because sometimes the peace and quiet isn't what it seems. Sometimes it's hiding something far worse than you could ever imagine, and once you've seen it, you can never truly unsee it. The park will always be waiting, ready to welcome you back into its twisted version of Christmas cheer. I remember the night the star went missing. It was early December, just after the city workers had placed our giant star on top of the huge Christmas tree in the central square. That star was a tradition. Every year, we gathered to watch it being raised. It was large, made of metal and glass, and it shone bright, visible from almost any point in our small town. I watched it go up, standing with a few neighbors, the air cold, my breath visible. Everything seemed normal then. A few nights later, I heard people talking on the street. I stepped outside and saw a small crowd in the square. It was dark, too dark. The star on the tree was gone. I blinked, thinking maybe someone dimmed the lights. But no, the star had disappeared completely. The top of the tree was bare. People whispered to each other. Some wondered if it had fallen and broken. Others said maybe it was stolen. The mayor arrived, looking upset and confused. He ordered a quick search. We all walked around, looking under benches, checking behind decorations. Nothing. That star was huge and heavy. It couldn't just vanish silently. The next morning, children at the school said they saw the star in the sky during the night, like it had drifted away. I didn't believe that at first. It sounded like a silly rumor, but more kids insisted. They described it floating above rooftops, then disappearing behind the hills. The adults dismissed it, but I felt uneasy. Our town's lights started flickering at odd times. Streetlights blinked and went dark for a few seconds, then came back. My own kitchen light flickered while I made coffee. Neighbors mentioned missing objects. A lantern from a porch disappeared. A small garden statue vanished. Nothing big, just small items gone without explanation. We had no leads on the star. The mayor called in the local police chief. They examined the tree, found no signs of tampering. The supports were intact, no broken chains or cut wires. It was as if the star lifted itself off. They tried not to show fear, but I saw the worry on their faces. The newspapers came, wrote stories, but no one had real answers. My stomach felt tight whenever I walked by the empty tree. A few days later, a friend knocked on my door early in the morning. She was pale and nervous. She said she saw the star again, late at night, hanging low over the edge of town. I asked if she was sure. She swore she saw its shape, its glow, but it looked different. Dimmer and moving slowly. I tried to imagine that heavy metal star just floating in the air. It made no sense. We decided to check the area where she claimed to have seen it. We found footprints in the snow near the outskirts, big footprints, larger than any boot. They were spaced far apart, like something with a huge stride had passed through. We followed them until they ended abruptly at a fence. On the other side of the fence, the snow was untouched. It was as if whatever made them just vanished. We said nothing to each other. I felt sweat on my palms despite the cold. We hurried back to town, pretending it was no big deal. That evening, more lights blinked off around town. The power lines checked out fine. The electric company had no explanation. People locked their doors earlier than usual. The streets felt quieter. Children stayed indoors. Rumors spread fast. Some said the star had come alive. Others said something stole it and roamed the skies with it. I kept my curtains drawn and tried to watch TV, but the signal cut in and out. At one point, the screen went dark, and in the reflection, I thought I saw a faint shape outside my window. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. I felt my heart beating faster. As Christmas approached, the tension grew. More objects vanished. A large wooden sled from a front yard disappeared overnight. A big wreath from the church door went missing. People woke to find strange marks in the snow, as if something dragged heavy objects away. The mayor held a meeting, urging calm. He promised to find the star before Christmas Eve. But we had no leads. The police drove around at night, shining spotlights, finding nothing. One officer said he spotted a strange glow in the sky, but by the time he aimed his flashlight, it was gone. A group of us decided to stay up one night and watch the town from a hidden spot. We climbed onto the roof of a storage shed near the town center. It was cold. My toes went numb and my breath fogged in the air. We took turns scanning the horizon. Around 2 a.m., one of us tapped my shoulder and pointed silently. I saw a faint glow above the far end of town. It flickered, moving slowly, like a lantern carried by a tall figure. We couldn't see clearly what it was. We climbed down and approached quietly, sticking to the shadows. As we got closer, the glow faded. We found nothing in that spot. But we did find more footprints, huge and deep. One friend pressed his hand into one print, and it was twice as long and wide as his hand. We said nothing, just stared at each other, our faces lit by a weak flashlight. I heard a faint sound above us, like a soft whoosh of air. I looked up at the dark sky, saw only stars and clouds, but my neck tingled. I felt watched. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the mayor arranged for a new star, a smaller one, to be placed on the tree. He wanted to restore some cheer. The workers climbed up, attached it, and plugged it in. It glowed feebly, nothing like the original. People gathered in the late afternoon, trying to smile and pretend everything was normal. I stood near the back, hands in my coat pockets, scanning the rooftops. I saw kids holding their parents' hands, eyes wide with worry. Some whispered that the original star would return that night. I hoped not. I just wanted this to end. As evening came, the sky turned dark gray. Snow fell lightly. The lights in the town began flickering more frequently. Then, at exactly 9 p.m., a sudden blackout plunged the entire town into darkness. People screamed. I stumbled forward, reached out, felt someone's coat sleeve. We waited, breathing hard. After a minute, the lights flickered back on. The small replacement star on the tree was gone now too. In its place, just empty branches. I heard gasps and curses. Someone said they saw something move fast across the sky when the lights went out. We ran around with flashlights, trying to catch a glimpse of anything. The air felt heavy. I thought I heard distant footsteps, a crunching sound, but it might have been my own shoes in the snow. The mayor shouted for everyone to go home and lock their doors. People scrambled away, leaving the square empty. I stood there alone for a moment, my heart pounding. I looked up, saw nothing but clouds, yet I felt something massive pass overhead, blocking distant stars for a second. My skin prickled. I decided I had to see if there was any clue in the spot where we found footprints before. I walked alone, flashlight in hand, towards the outskirts. It was risky and stupid. The streets were empty, every window dark. No Christmas lights now. All had gone out. The silence pressed on my ears. The snow crunched under my boots. My breath was loud. As I reached the fence line where we saw footprints before, I noticed something glinting in the faint moonlight. A piece of metal, twisted, with colored glass embedded. It looked like a fragment of the star. I picked it up, my fingers numb, and slipped it into my pocket. I shone my flashlight around, saw more pieces scattered in the snow. The star had been torn apart somehow. I swallowed hard, feeling panic rise in my chest. If it was torn apart, what was that thing carrying? Suddenly I heard a low noise like a groan. I froze, light shaking in my hand. The sound came from above me. I tilted my head back slowly. For a second, I saw a huge shape silhouetted against the faint glow of distant town lights. It was tall, looming behind the fence. I couldn't see details, just a large form with something large and metallic in its grasp. I choked back a scream and backed away slowly. The shape didn't move. I took another step, nearly slipping on ice. When I looked again, it was gone. The fence line was empty. I turned and ran. I ran faster than I ever had, heart hammering, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I reached my house. I locked the door, pulled the curtains shut, and sat on the floor trying to calm my breathing. I couldn't understand what I saw. Something tall and silent, carrying that big star. I felt tears in my eyes, not from sadness, but from sheer confusion and fear. Outside, the night was silent. No lights, no laughter, no Christmas cheer. Just darkness and the memory of that huge shape. I stayed awake, knife in hand, every muscle tense. Around midnight, I heard a soft whoosh again, like giant wings or a huge cape of darkness passing over my rooftop. I held my breath, listening to my heartbeat in my ears. The sound faded. I stared at the wall, praying for morning. At dawn, the power came back. Some lights turned on. Neighbors stepped out cautiously, looking at the empty tree. The mayor was there, pale and shaken. No one asked about the star anymore. They just moved around quietly. We all knew something had happened that we couldn't explain. The newspapers printed vague stories about vandalism and theft, but we all knew better. People avoided talking about it after that day. Christmas passed in a strange mood. Families stayed indoors, doors locked, curtains closed. The atmosphere was heavy, as if everyone knew something uninvited had passed through our town. I tried to tell a friend what I saw at the fence line, but he just shook his head, told me to forget it. He said we should move on, pretend it never happened. In the following weeks, no more objects disappeared. No more lights flickered. The city workers removed the tree earlier than usual. The mayor never mentioned putting a star up again. We returned to our routines, but with a lingering sense of unease. I kept that fragment of the star hidden in my closet. Sometimes I take it out and feel its rough edges, the twisted metal and colored glass. It reminds me that something large and unknown came to our town that winter. It took our star, took small objects, and then vanished into the night sky. I don't know where it came from or why it visited us. I only know the fear I felt, the way my stomach clenched, the way my heart pounded when I saw that shape. Even now, years later, I don't hang bright decorations outside. I keep my house dim at Christmas, just a small tree indoors. I don't want to attract attention. When I look at the dark sky above our quiet streets, I sometimes remember the sound of that whoosh, the silent passing of something overhead, and I close my curtains and hope it never comes back. I found the wrapping paper in my attic a few weeks before Christmas. I had gone up there to look for some old ornaments. The attic was dusty, cramped, and smelled like old cardboard. I pulled aside a box and noticed a roll of gift wrap in a corner. It had bright colors, lots of Christmas trees, and smiling children drawn on it. It looked old-fashioned, maybe something left behind by the previous owners. I didn't remember buying it. I shrugged and took it downstairs with my decorations. I thought maybe I'd use it for some presents. That first day, I unrolled a bit of the paper on my dining table. The children were drawn simply, wearing little hats and scarves, all smiling around a Christmas tree. It looked cheerful. I cut a piece to wrap a small box for a friend. Then I left the roll on a chair and went about my day. The house was quiet. I live alone, so no one would have touched it. The next morning, I came back to wrap more presents. I unrolled the paper again and paused. The children on the paper had changed positions. The day before, I was sure they stood in a circle holding hands. Now, one of the children stood slightly off to the side, as if looking out of the paper. I thought maybe I remembered it wrong. I shook my head, feeling a little confused, but I kept wrapping. I decided not to think too much about it. Maybe I just didn't pay enough attention before. A day later, I had more gifts to wrap. I grabbed the paper roll. When I unrolled it, I noticed the children looked different again. The smiles seemed less bright. Their faces appeared more concerned. The Christmas tree in the background looked like it had fewer lights on it. I felt a chill. I ran my finger over the paper, expecting some trick, but it was just normal gift wrap. The ink didn't smear. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was tired. I decided to use different wrapping paper for the rest of my gifts. I placed the odd roll aside, in a closet. I thought maybe I'd been working too hard, or maybe I was just mistaken about the images. But that night, as I passed by the living room, I saw the closet door was slightly open. I knew I'd closed it. I opened the door and found the roll of wrapping paper partially unrolled on the floor. My heart thumped. I knelt down and rolled it back up, careful to keep it tight. I told myself it must have fallen off a shelf. I locked the closet door this time. The next morning, the roll was under my Christmas tree. I stared at it, heart pounding. I was sure I locked it up. I picked it up slowly, feeling uneasy. The children on the paper looked directly at me now. Their eyes seemed focused, no longer just generic drawings. Their mouths were turned down slightly, no smiles left. The Christmas tree behind them looked darker, like the lights were off. I felt my hands tremble. I put the roll in a bag, carried it outside, and dropped it in my trash bin. I stood there in the cold backyard, breathing hard, trying to calm down. Later that day, I checked the trash. The roll was gone. My stomach clenched. I returned inside and searched the house. Nothing. I tried to ignore it and watched some TV, ate dinner, and went to bed early. But I couldn't sleep well. I kept imagining the children's eyes on that paper. The next day, I woke up and found the roll lying on my kitchen counter. I gasped, stepping back. I hadn't heard anything in the night. My doors were locked. There were no footprints in the light dusting of snow outside. Yet, here it was. I forced myself to look at it closely. The images had changed again. Now the children stood very close together, their faces worried. One child pointed off the edge of the paper. The tree behind them looked bare, no decorations left. I touched the surface with a shaking hand. It felt normal, smooth paper. I picked it up and tried tearing it. The paper was tough, but I managed to rip a small piece off. I examined the torn piece. The image on it showed part of a child's arm. It looked so detailed, like a photograph, but not quite. I burned that torn piece in my fireplace. It crackled and turned to ash. I smiled grimly, thinking maybe I could destroy the whole roll this way. I returned to the kitchen counter, grabbed the roll, and marched to the fireplace. I fed it in, bit by bit. The paper resisted tearing sometimes, but I kept at it. Soon, the entire roll was burning. I watched flames curl around the drawings, the children's faces twisting in the heat. After it was all ash, I poked it with a poker. Nothing remained but gray powder. I cleaned the hearth and felt relief. I sat on the couch, breathing slowly. I told myself it was over. Whatever weirdness that was, it was gone. I had lunch, watched TV, tried to forget. That night, I heard a scratching sound upstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and headed up. The sound came from the attic. I rarely go up there except to store old boxes. My heart pounded as I climbed the ladder. The attic was dark and musty. I shone the flashlight around. The floorboards creaked under my feet. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just boxes and old junk. Then I noticed something on the far wall, a faint pattern, like printed images. I moved closer, my hand shaking with the flashlight beam. On the attic wall, I saw the same children from the wrapping paper. Their images were faint but visible, as if printed directly onto the wooden boards. My mouth went dry. I reached out and touched the wall. The images felt smooth and slightly cold. As I watched, they seemed to shift. The children looked scared now, their eyes wide. The Christmas tree behind them was almost gone, just a faint outline. I stepped back, nearly tripping over a box. I ran down the ladder, shut the attic door, and leaned against the wall, breathing hard. I had burned the paper. How could the images be on the attic wall now? I considered leaving my house, checking into a hotel, but it was late. It was winter. I tried to calm myself. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I was too stressed. I made some tea and tried to watch a movie. The TV picture flickered. For a moment, I thought I saw one of the children's faces appear in the static. I turned the TV off, heart pounding again. I needed to see if the images were still up there. Maybe I imagined it. I grabbed my camera and returned to the attic. The images were still there, clearer now. The children looked directly at me. Their little faces showed fear or pleading. I couldn't tell. The tree was completely gone, just empty space behind them. I took a photo with my camera, hoping to prove I wasn't crazy. The flash lit up the attic, and I swear I saw one of the children blink. I stumbled back, swearing out loud. I turned off the flashlight, relying only on the faint glow from outside. In the dim light, I saw the children move, very slowly, Like a sequence of frames, they inched closer to me on the wall. I screamed and rushed down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut. I pushed a chair under the handle and ran to my bedroom, locking the door. I lay in bed, trembling, listening for any sound. The house was quiet, except for my racing heartbeat. I didn't sleep well. I woke up early, feeling tired and jittery. I decided to call someone, but who would believe me? I thought about calling a friend, but what would I say? I have moving pictures of children on my attic wall that came from a cursed wrapping paper roll. They'd think I lost my mind. I forced myself to eat breakfast. The toast tasted like cardboard. I went outside and walked around the house. The morning air was cold, my breath fogging. I looked up at the attic window. Nothing strange from outside. I considered leaving, selling the house, anything to escape this. But I needed to check again. Maybe the images vanished in daylight. I climbed back up to the attic, heart hammering. The images were still there. Now the children were pressed right against the surface of the wall, as if trapped behind a thin layer. Their eyes followed me as I moved. One child reached a hand forward. I saw the tiny fingers move, pressing against the wood from inside. I screamed and hurled a box at the wall. The image flickered, but the children remained. I yelled at them, asking what they wanted. No answer, just their silent, moving faces. I tried scratching at the wall with a screwdriver, hoping to scrape off the image. The wood resisted me. No matter how hard I scratched, no paint or paper peeled away. The images were inside the wood somehow. I slammed my fist against the wall in frustration. The children flinched, as if startled by the impact. Tears ran down my cheeks. I begged them to stop, to go away. No response. They just stared with those sad, frightened eyes. I had to think of something else. I rushed downstairs and grabbed a can of paint. I climbed back up and tried painting over the images. The first coat covered their faces partially, turning them into blurry shapes. But as the paint dried, it cracked and peeled away, revealing their faces again, even clearer this time. I nearly broke down sobbing. It was hopeless. I remembered burning the paper. Fire might be the answer again, but burning my attic would destroy my house. I lit a small candle and held it near the wall. The heat made the wood warm, but the images stayed. I didn't dare start a real fire up here. That would endanger me and possibly spread to the rest of the house. I stumbled downstairs feeling dizzy. My head pounded. I paced the living room. Maybe if I ignored it, they'd go away. That sounded insane, but I had no better idea. I locked the attic door again, pushed furniture against it, and avoided looking at the ceiling. I tried to distract myself by cleaning the kitchen, turning on the radio. Static greeted me. I thought I heard faint childish voices in the static, so I turned it off quickly. Night came. I sat on my couch in the dark, all lights off, hugging my knees. I listened for any noise from above. Around midnight, I heard a faint scraping sound. It came from the attic door. I clenched my teeth, trying not to scream. The scraping continued, slow and steady, like tiny fingernails on wood. I shouted, "Leave me alone." The noise paused, then resumed. I grabbed my flashlight and my car keys. I decided to leave, at least for the night. I ran to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. The winter air bit my face. I looked up at the attic window. In the faint moonlight, I saw shadows moving behind the glass, tiny shapes shifting. I drove to a motel in town and got a room. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, half expecting the children to appear there too. They didn't, but I slept poorly. In the morning, I returned home. I opened the front door slowly. The house was silent. I checked the attic door. It was still barricaded. I waited a long time before I moved the furniture aside. With shaking hands, I opened the attic door and climbed up. The walls were covered now, not just one section. The images spread across every surface. The children were everywhere, hundreds of them, all staring at me. Some looked angry, others terrified. Many reached out with tiny hands, pressing against the wood. I screamed and stumbled down the ladder, slamming the door shut. My chest tightened. I gasped for air. I realized I couldn't stay here. I couldn't fix this. The house belonged to me, but it was no longer safe. Something impossible had taken over. I grabbed a suitcase and stuffed in clothes and some personal items. I didn't care about the rest. I'd call someone later, maybe a priest, maybe a demolition crew, but I couldn't live here. As I left, I noticed the Christmas tree in the living room. Under it, a small square of paper lay on the floor. I approached it slowly. It was a piece of that wrapping paper, a small scrap that must have survived the fire. It showed one child's face, eyes wide and sad. I picked it up with trembling fingers and stuffed it in my pocket without thinking. I just wanted it out of sight. I locked the front door and got in my car. I drove away without looking back. I don't know what will happen to that house now. Maybe someone else will find those images someday. Maybe they'll fade over time. But I'm not going back. I can still see those children's eyes when I close my own. I can still feel their silent pleas. I'll find a new place to live, far away, and try to forget that cursed wrapping paper and what it did to my home.